Hello, everybody. Today we had a debate between Aron Ra and Converse Contender on sort of biblical slavery, which is a topic I've debated before. And a lot of quotes were being drawn from certain sources that Converse Contender was using, including Dr. Josh Bowen, who I have enormous respect for. But um, so this Royal Rumble was when I went to the Aftershow, and it was a good conversation. And even there was a theist there who said, you've got to acknowledge that the Bible endorses slavery." His reasons were a bit horrifying, but even he was saying, "Hey, yeah, it does seem to," which you would expect from the Old Testament. Um, so I got into it a bit with him, and it was a very frustrating conversation. It sort of he sidetracked almost constantly during the debate. If you saw the one between Aron Ra and Converse Contender on Modern Day Debate, and he was no different in the after show, as I found out. But I hope you enjoy, and let's get ready to rumble.
Mark Reid, what is up? We are Skeptic and Ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? I feel like this is a very easy true or false quiz.
What do you think, Mark?
But what are your thoughts about the topic, debate, or anything we talk about?
Yeah, so the Bible is absolutely pro-slavery. This debate was kind of odd, and you're right, they kept going back to the mic, and it's like, oh, I can very easily demonstrate that all your electronics were made by slave labor kind of thing. I don't think you can, actually. The whole idea that all lithium is mined by sort of unpaid workers or horribly paid workers or something is actually false. Australia mines lithium, and we have very strong laws against slavery, so I know that isn't true. That just is not true. So And sort of you can make this argument, you can sort of go to this argument, oh, well, the workers in China that make, sort of majority of the electronics are sort of slave labor. And yeah, there is problems with underpaid work in China and things like that.
There are exploited workers out there.
Absolutely. I'm not questioning that. There are workers that are probably paid less than they should, but I wouldn't call them slave workers, like they're just sort of, I mean, there's people in America that are paid less than they should. I still don't think they're slave workers.
If I could just use a word there, it is
no.
What about this? No.
No. How dare you? No, you're absolutely right. No, absolutely. Yeah, and that's something that I was probably going to bring up, but absolutely, that is the best word for it. In philosophy and logic, it's called the tu quoque fallacy. So what that means in Latin is, and you also, like you do the same thing. So if just because workers are horribly paid in China and it would constitute sort of slave labor, does not mean that the Bible gets a pass. Now, here's the thing that I want to really point out, and I wish Aron had gone to this, because it's really important. You also have to consider what control we have over people being underpaid in third world countries. Like, I don't have any control over that whatsoever. And I try to buy products that I know, come from ethical places, but it's kind of impossible to tell for sure. Regardless of what Converse Contender says, it's kind of impossible to know for sure. And I can try, but I can't change things in those countries. I don't just
go into a country like Vietnam and institute our own economic reforms, even though maybe we would if we could, but we're just not in that position.
Yeah, because that went so well for you guys last time, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, so actually Titan gave me awesome advice, never start a land war in Asia. But look,
solid.
But God has that power. He has direct influence over, well, everything, really. Let's face it. He can change anything that he wants. He can dictate anything he wants. And I thought it was really evident that Aron had such a solid point when he was saying, hey, would the world be a better place if God just put in the Bible, do not own slaves? Yeah, because the obvious dodging and, I don't understand the question and I agree with the disagree. One of the instead of 10 commandments, you could have 11 commandments, right? The main ones, the ones that they keep referring to, saying, thou shalt not own or purchase slaves. That's it. That's all it would take, and the world would have been a better place. But he so didn't want to go to, hey, yeah, God could have done that. He can do anything, and the world would have been better. So
and this
I
cop
think there
out
was
that they always use. This
one?
cop out they
I
always
mean, you're
use.
going to have to be more specific, James.
That
Yeah.
God's before me is way more important than not owning people. There's only room for 10.
Well, this cop out
Is
that
that
they
a
use,
cop-out?
like, well, God wasn't endorsing slavery. You see, they were going to do it anyway, so God just set up some rules so it wouldn't be as bad as maybe some of the other people were doing it. But that really doesn't work
fairness,
because
they originally did have don't own slaves, but it was that he had 15. Shit. 10 commandments.
Did God say?
Yeah,
did God say,
I know the reference.
Did God say, you know what, being gay is not ideal, but there are people who are going to be gay, so I guess we'll all allow it. So that no, he didn't say that. He said, ooh, that's icky, kill him. Did God say, well, you know what, I don't want people to work on the Sabbath, but you know, if it's an emergency and you need to do work, you do what you got to do, no big deal. He said, no, kill him. So God doesn't care what we think about his rules. He could, if he really hated slavery, he could have just said, no, don't do it. But he didn't do that.
Well, the problem comes, and there was a lot of dodging where the slaves were actually present in the ancient Levant that the Old Testament is concerning. I've had this debate against multiple people, and of course they did have slaves. Now, the word for slave, abed, it can mean a number of things. It certainly can mean a number of things. But when you're talking about sort of Leviticus in particular and Exodus, it absolutely is talking about people that are owned. For instance, in Exodus 21, which is sort of the famous sort of, make slavery a thing, you're talking about if a bull gores a man or woman, the sort of you pay the person, the owner of the bull pays the person. But if it gores a slave or an ebed, you pay the owner of the slave the compensation. So Dr. Josh points out in his book that that there definitely was a case that the slaves were not considered. Yeah, and that's the exact book. I really highly recommend it. It's excellent. Because Dr. Josh Bowen, he's very, very fair. It doesn't say like, oh, this is horrible, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, conditions in sort of that time in the ancient Israel were actually better than most parts of the world at the time. That
Can I
doesn't
just say,
mean,
Mark, that I've been going through this in the past few hours. It feels heavily mined. It's very weird. It just feels like a bunch of quotes have been just taken right out of context.
Just lifted and carried away.
Just lifted.
Yeah.
Magic.
And sort of so this whole idea that they weren't really slaves. They were servants, they were bondsmen, they were this. Like, under any current definition, like, what they're trying to say is they weren't chattel slaves. And for the most part, that is true. They did have certain rights to freedom. They had certain rights to, if they got injured bad, they did have certain rights. But we don't just say chattel slavery is the only form of slavery. Debt slavery is a thing. That is definitely a thing, and it falls very firmly under debt slavery. There is elements of chattel slavery. I don't think Dr. Josh sort of goes as far as to say it's chattel slavery, but there's definitely elements in there, like a person born into slavery is a slave. It's chattel slavery. But
and slaves under any system had some degree of rights. They all had some rights.
Absolutely. Well, in fact, in New York, when it was New Amsterdam, slaves had the right to marry, and their owners could not separate the husband and wife. They had that right. Okay, so if you were married as a slave, you could not be separated from your wife. When the English came in, they abolished that law for slaves. Then they could be separated. So it depends on, but they're still slaves. Just because you have a right doesn't make you not a slave.
You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You can be given some rights and you're still a slave. That's not an excuse.
And okay, I I have a question for you, Mark, but I'm going to get it after we get someone in because I feel like I owe it to them. And
More
so,
friends.
yes, I already have it starred. And so we're going to keep on going in, though. Corey, welcome to Skeptic and Ranting. We are Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? I just realized that this is supposed to be a midnight ranting. We are one of those things. We are ranting. And welcome. What are your thoughts about the topic, the debate, or anything we've been talking about tonight?
Well, for sure, it's pro-slavery. But there's something that a lot of people are forgetting here is that the fact that slavery is even mentioned in the Bible without any whoa, like red flags. Now, listen here. This is a God that's supposed to know the future and knows what slavery is going to be like in the future if we grant it to be true. So why is there chattel slavery? Why is there any terms of slavery? Why can't we use different terms? Why can't this deity use some other term to get us to understand this? This is perfectly there for a reason if we take it as the word of God. And for that reason, I don't think you can sit there and absolutely say, nah, God didn't mean it to mean actual slavery. Bullshit.
You have to understand, although it says slavery, what it means is not slavery. You see?
Naturally. It kind of reminds me of I think it was a non-stamp collector cartoon from like 11 years ago or something, where God is talking to the angels and laying out the rules of slavery. And he says, if you have a Hebrew slave, you can only keep them 7 years and yada yada. And the angels are like, but what about everyone else? And he's like, no, I'm saying if you're a Hebrew slave, you can't keep them more than 7 years. He just, nope, not going to touch it.
Don't worry about that.
The problem is the words that they use. So abed is the word for slave, but it's also the word for anybody in lower station than yourself, kind of thing. So it can be translated. So much of it is contextual.
True, but why have the text be like that? Like your God, why would you have something so grotesque be dictated in some type of language? Why would you allow that to occur? There should be...
The people of the time understood the context. That's why.
Yeah, I understand that, but we're talking about a being that would have been able to give these people this language. Like, he dictates everything. So why does slavery in one period sound... It's completely different than slavery in a different type of period. We know what slavery is. It should be considered one thing and one thing only, and that should be detestable. And we should never even have it to begin with.
So sometimes when the Bible uses the word slave, it really means more like what we would classify as servant. And sometimes when it uses the word servant, it actually would more correlate to what we would consider a slave. There's a little bit of
kind of the same word.
Translation differences there, kind of choice of the translator, which term to use.
Yeah,
we see the same word. It's the same word, but there is a different word for hired workers, like hired workers that you're hiring on a temporary basis, kind of thing, rather than a servant that's sort of part of your family. But the same word is used for servants that are part of your family and slaves, because they're considered property of your family. And that's, reading contextually, you have to see where they're talking about somebody who is a hired servant and somebody who is a slave that is owned.
Yeah, there was a lot in the Old Testament where it was just taken for granted that certain groups of people were considered property, like all those passages about selling your daughter and all that sort of stuff. They didn't have to outright say, your daughter is property to be sold. It was part of the general cultural milieu.
Sure.
Everyone is property to someone else, apparently.
Yeah, it speaks to the normalcy of it, like just the everyday actions of, oh, well, we have slaves, we sell our daughters into slavery. That's kind of misleading, because that is sort of, in a way, it is kind of a selling a daughter to be part of somebody's family. It's almost like a concubine situation that can lead to marriage.
Yeah,
but
it's not necessarily
So,
slavery, but it's that underlying context
yeah,
that everyone is property to be bought and
Does
sold.
she have a choice
right,
in the
right.
matter? No.
Especially women. Women
So
are
she's going to be
property
having
in
sex
that day and age.
with this guy. It's
Yeah,
not her choice. It's she's been
yeah.
sold into that.
Well, the horrific thing about that is if he's unhappy with her performance and what she's doing, he can return the goods, basically.
Right.
He can redeem her
She's not putting
back to
out.
the right. But he's not allowed to redeem her to a foreigner, kind of thing. So there's some laws around that. But
Yeah,
he's
just
it
like
doesn't say,
products
hey,
today.
if she's unhappy where she is, she can leave. No, it
When
doesn't
you
say that.
say
It's
it like that, like Redeemer, it sounds like you have such great sex that you've redeemed
Yeah.
her.
I
Make
was
sure you
thinking
keep your
return to the
receipt.
manufacturer.
Yeah, make sure you keep your receipt for that one. Yeah.
So I'm gonna give you like a 7 here. You were like a 10 here, but you're kind of like a 5 here. So just if we could just work on that.
I would just comment in chat. They were talking a little bit about
Yeah.
the modern capitalism and the way it correlates to slavery. And I would just say that the fact that you can draw certain parallels to modern capitalism and slavery in no way makes slavery any less bad. That just means that our current system is not perfect. I think everybody realizes that. How do we move forward? What would be a better system? I think there's lots of disagreements about that, but it doesn't absolve the fact that slavery.
And
Look,
that's why I
underpaid
tried.
workers is a problem. Like, nobody's saying that's not a problem. That's a problem. Just because something is happening that is wrong doesn't make another wrong thing right. This is the whataboutism Amy was talking about. Like, we can say, hey, people are underpaid. There's a wage gap that exists. It has to be addressed, kind of thing. It doesn't mean you get off for like going, well, we have slaves. Sorry, Corey, go ahead.
It's still a little bit
I
better
brought
than
it-
slavery, but yeah, go ahead.
That's why I brought it the way I did, because regardless of the argument, and I mean, regardless of how you phrase it, slavery is still slavery. But a lot of people gonna justify it by God's actions. So when you take away the fact that God is in control and He has control over the whole situation, how it's dictated, how is it translated, and how it's brought down through generations, and understanding the future and the context of those words, I just don't know how you can justify. Yeah, I'm a God. This thing that's horrific, I'm going to say my people can do so.
Yeah, well, it doesn't affect him any, so why would he care?
Yeah,
Well,
why would he
God
care?
doesn't
He seems like a
God
prick.
doesn't-
Seems
wait,
like an asshole.
God doesn't seem to have the omniscience of a sort of all-seeing being. In fact, he seems to have less wisdom than somebody living these days who would say, hey, we've got to make these laws clear and definitive.
You want
Right.
to get this in?
Yes, so we're gonna, and eventually after Duchess, I think I have a question for you, Mark, or someone tagged you, but I
Okay.
want to get Duchess in. Duchess of Clutches, welcome. We are
Hey,
Skeptic
Duchess.
and Ranting, as well as Midnight Ranting. We are talking about, is the Bible pro-slavery? How are you, and what are your thoughts about the topic, the debate, or anything we ranted about tonight?
I'm good. Hope you guys are good. How's my audio?
Sounds
Great.
great.
Coming in good.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Good. I have a really brief little thing that I wrote throughout the debate because I finally caught one of them. So, is slavery acceptable in the Bible? If that's the question, yes, of course. But the only way that we can know that is through coming at it in good faith. God is petty because all of the humans who made him were petty, and that's why there's commandments to love him above all else, and not the commandment, thou shalt not own thy neighbor. The only straw atheists can grasp onto is a conspiracy by suggesting that the well-established linguists across hundreds of years somehow got the translation wrong. This debate demonstrated the fundamental misunderstanding that theists have about what science is and what it does, linguistics being one of those sciences. Scientists do not rely on dogmatic adherence to a priest, rabbi, imam, etc., who need to use an easy lie of God to comfort theists. When a scientist tests, they look for ways to disprove their theory, not look for ways to confirm what they already believed to be true and wouldn't have changed their mind about it if presented evidence anyway. Theists believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with a person saying, I don't know, and they don't see how bizarre it is to think that you know everything before beginning some experiment. Otherwise, why bother searching? But unfortunately, that's what theists has done. Stop searching because they're afraid of what they might find. We know instinctively, and this is kind of what got me at the end of the debate here, when he was just asked the very, very easy question. We all know instinctively that the world would be better had slavery never existed. And I think one of the saddest and worst parts is that people like him know this instinctively as well. It's sad to see.
It's a written on our hearts kind of thing.
Well, I think it's just moral intuition. It's hard to say if the world would be better or worse because you don't have any counterfactuals, but at least moral intuition would tell us that's probably almost certainly true. So because slavery has been the cause of some of the worst atrocities in sort of recent or living memory, that you could make a good case that that's true.
But right. But since we can't actually test it, we never know really.
Right.
It's hard to say. But it does seem intuitive that it probably would have been better without it.
Most likely, absolutely. In all probability, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but it wasn't so much that. It was the way that he was dodging the question, sort of asking, like, oh, I disagree with the premises. Like, he was being so uncharitable. Like, he knew what Aron was asking, and it was obvious what he was asking, and he just tried to sort of nitpick around it kind of thing. It's like, yeah. He didn't want to answer. Actually, he didn't answer many questions for him. You know, he didn't actually answer much at all. Somebody in the chat commented he seemed to dodge all questions, and I was like, yeah, he did.
He did.
He didn't.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I was thinking he should run for office. He's a born politician if he wanted to be.
Do you guys remember when he really stepped in it, when he really messed up, when he said, well, it's basically how you atheists read the Bible? And then Aron was like, no. It's not how atheists read the Bible. It's how Christians have read the Bible.
Yeah.
Because they were the ones out there enslaving people consistent with what the Bible says. They were reading it, applying it, and going out and enslaving people.
Yeah, that's literally what our Civil War was about. Was there were Bible believers on both sides. There were people using the passages in the Bible to say, you know, the South is right and whatnot.
Well, it was weird. We got a super chat come through where somebody said, oh, why weren't there any secular people on the abolitionist side? And it's like, what are you talking about?
You see that every freaking time.
Darwin and his entire family were abolitionists. You know, you can't get more secular than that. Like, what are you talking about? There was a great deal of, just because you're ignorant of them being there doesn't mean they didn't exist. There's a lot of abolitionists.
I'm going to pass it back to you in a second, Mark, but then when you're done, tell me so we can get Rubik's in. But John Rapp, what is up? It says, did you notice how many times CC claimed the Bible abolishes and condemns slavery? Gotta lie, it's a Bible thumb.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it doesn't. I think he was trying to get it like it condemns stealing people and things like that, which isn't slavery. That's actually stealing property, like somebody is property.
I've had theists recently come at me about that in particular in like comments and whatnot, and they're like, oh, well, here's this passage. And I'm like, this is very clearly about human trafficking. If you kidnap someone and take them across a border, what are you talking about, slavery? Come on now.
Yeah, and that's basically sort of saying, hey, respect the other person belongs to somebody else. Like, respect that this slave belongs to another person and don't steal them. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to buy a slave from a slave trader from outside your lands and take them back home and have them as a slave.
2 points. Pat says, I don't know if Josh said it was a better form of slavery. By comparison, throughout the wider region, it varied over time, as many things do, historically speaking.
Okay, I stand corrected. That's fine. Like, I know that it was better at some points, though. Like, you know.
Well, my bigger point and the reason why I bring those stuff up is because God should know anyway, right? Like I would be up for. You would think God would be able to say, once again, I was on that freaking broken tablet, maybe. Don't own slaves. But thank you,
We don't
sending
have
love
perfect
Pat,
knowledge,
sending
and we
love to
don't have
Mark, and
perfect morality like we're told God does, but yet
Right.
he wasn't able to see that one coming.
Shane says, when I die, I want my remains spread across Disneyland, but I don't want to be cremated. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Just
dark.
be
Yeah, that's dark.
decorations.
Does make sense.
They do have
Maybe we
a
can-
haunted house at Disneyland, right?
Maybe we can incorporate him in some way into the Pirates of the Caribbean feature and sticking out of a
Yo
shot.
ho, yo ho.
Or a catapult, whatever comes first. Anyway, sending so much love. Why is owning? Well, because it's owning people as property. What is up, Ellie Brown? What is up?
Okay. Eli Brown, why is owning slaves wrong? Because it's not good for the well-being of the slaves, and it's not even good for the well-being of the owners. What happens when you create low-level, low-class workers that do not have any money is that usually the middle class will sell to the lower class. Basically, that's where the majority of the goods come from, because the middle class and upper class aren't buying as much. So that lower class has got to be able to afford things. Slaves don't actually buy anything. So what you actually end up doing is destroying the middle class. And from there, you'll end up with two class distinctions, an upper class and slaves. That's all. That is one of the very many reasons that the Roman Empire collapsed. There's a lot more reasons, a lot more things, but it does create problems. It's not good for the society. To have a flourishing, happy society, we don't own people. It's never resulted in a flourishing society. I mean, if you want a society where rebellions happen and we eat the rich from time to time, well, maybe
How many
you're for it.
slave rebellions did Rome go through? Several.
Oh, tons of them. Slaves revolted all the time. The military, sort of put down slave revolts all the time. I mean, even in antebellum slavery of the South, there was slave revolts.
It sounds like someone's about to say something, but when you're done, please tell me, and then no one else, so I can get Rubik's.
Well, I would just
Sure.
I would say that Abraham Lincoln, he said, when you familiarize yourself with the chains of bondage, you prepare yourself to wear them. And what he meant was, when you have a system that allows people to be enslaved, you're thinking, okay, well, it's not me, so I'm in the clear, but it's only a matter of time before somebody comes along and thinks, actually, you know what? Maybe you should be the one wearing the chains. So it's probably better off if we don't enslave anybody. That way, it's better for you too, because you're never going to be threatened with enslavement.
Oh, no, wait, hold on. No, you give your point just 1 second. I just want to get them in here.
Yay, Rubik's.
Rubik's, welcome. We are Skeptic and Midnight. We're ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? I hope you are doing good. And what are your thoughts on the topic, debate, anything we talk about tonight?
It definitely isn't against slavery. Is what I'm saying.
Is it pro-slavery?
Seems to like slavery.
Yes, it seems to give rules on regulations on how to own people, which kind of shows that it's showing that this is how you own people, which isn't really a good thing.
Yeah.
I think I could put out that it normalizes slavery, at least.
Yes.
I'd almost want to say that the fact the Bible is in favor of slavery is itself a good reason to be against slavery. But to me, it's an autonomy issue. Like James was saying,
Sure.
When you make it an option, you become vulnerable to it yourself. And it's just
Sure.
nobody, if you don't have freedom for the lowest member of your society. You don't really have freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's John Rawls' veil of ignorance. That's sort of the way that it was postulated to create a flourishing society, is that no matter where you are in the society, your position is at least acceptable to you. And the whole and the whole point is even if you want to come at this completely selfishly, like what's in it for me, well, wouldn't you be happier living in a society where there are not people repressed and depressed and abused and treated horrendously?
Yeah,
Wouldn't
I don't
that be a
want to
better
be
society
owned.
for you?
I don't want to be beaten because my master feels like it. I don't want that to happen to anybody else either.
Yeah.
Well, that was the problem in the antebellum
Unless
South.
they're into that.
In the antebellum South, there were
we're not
very
talking
few
Exactly,
jobs.
unless you're into that.
There were very few
Essential
middle
slave master.
class or low class jobs because the slaves were doing all that work. So
Yep.
if you weren't the son of a wealthy planter, what work were you going? It was very hard to find work because the slaves were doing most of that. So what would you end up doing?
They took our jobs.
Yeah.
They took our germs.
I mean, it's kind of funny, but that's exactly what happens when you implement slavery. You know, all of the lower class jobs vanish.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what happens.
If you can get someone to do it for free,
It's not
you will.
conducive for a productive, growing, good society.
And I mean, I didn't hear that in the debate, but the sort of theists also make the, well, people in prisons do work for, almost nothing. They're slaves as well, which, look, I think rehabilitation programs are a bit different. I will acknowledge that some programs are basically using prisoners as slave labor. I think there's problems with it. And that doesn't, just because there's problems with that, and that is, sort of really bad, doesn't make anything else okay. But again, you have the same problem of jobs vanishing because people who are paid a pittance are doing them. Those programs are usually voluntary, if I remember correctly.
Most inmates say they're supposed to work. Well,
yeah.
I would say it like this: it's not that we imprison them to work; it's that they're a danger to society. So we can't just leave them. We have to imprison them, and since they're there, we work them to help offset the cost of their incarceration a little bit. And by the way, if they refuse to work, they don't get beaten. They don't get deprived of their essential needs and services. There are certain things that privileges prisoners get to make their incarceration a little bit easier. They might lose those if they refuse to work, but they're not going to be subject to torture or execution or anything like that. Notwithstanding the fact that there probably are problems and there probably should be reforms to that system, but it's not the same as chattel slavery.
Well, that's the sales pitch anyway. Having been in prisons as a delivery person, as a person studying criminal justice, as a person studying for a law degree, it doesn't actually work out like that. There's a term, I think it's a high school to prison pipeline, where people are just, we're literally putting people in prison to man the machines. We're just, but that's a U.S. thing. It's a whole other discussion, so I won't get into it here. But like
but
James
even
was saying,
if that is
people are compelled. It's
even
low
if that
grade
is happening, even if that was happening, it doesn't make slavery in the Bible right. Just because something wrong is happening in our current society that we acknowledge is wrong, doesn't make your thing right. It is a whataboutism, as Amy fantastically pointed out earlier. And I think that I do support the rehabilitation and teaching skills to prisoners. Like if you want to do computer classes and things like that, I have no problem with that.
Now, we may have someone who could disagree with us, may agree with us. It would never be Converse. Not at all, because it says it in the name. And so not Converse. Welcome. We are Skeptic and Ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery. Welcome on board. And what are your thoughts about the topic, the debate, or anything we talk about?
He did really bad in the debate, and it's just Aron did so good, and the Christians are just always so bad at everything. So I don't like them at all. Just meanies.
Well,
Big mean
yeah, I mean,
faces.
it's a
I'm
wide
just kidding.
field. I must admit, like, I'm not sure. Like, I have trouble finding opponents that aren't like really bad on the Christian side. It's hard.
I mean, you were going up against the juggernaut. He is one of the best debaters out there. So,
Who's that?
Aron Ra.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, you broke up for me. I might have to switch to a phone or something because my internet's so bad. You said you find hard to find opponents doing what now?
Yeah, to debate who can really bring a really good argument.
Yeah, the ones who are good at thinking keep switching to our side.
Well, I mean...
Well, I have the same issue. You see, the issue with me is that it's hard to keep somebody on track with the topic because it's always, oh, yeah, and what about this other thing I don't like about the Bible? What about, Christians in general and stuff, right? It's never just like, how do we exegete this passage, right? What did it mean to the people who are writing it?
Sure.
So whenever I ask things like I heard somebody say earlier, like, well, yeah, but there are Christians on both sides of the Civil War over the slavery thing. But it's but only one side of them was tearing out 90% of the Old Testament and 60% of the New Testament to give to their slaves because it would cause a revolt if they read all the foundational stories about slavery. So there's a big point there, I think.
Yeah.
You think it would? You think it'd be better? I mean, it wouldn't make a difference, you think?
I think you can make a good case from a biblical standpoint that slavery is acceptable, purely from an internal standpoint.
Yeah, but when you've got slaves and you've indoctrinated them into Christianity and you set up their churches and whatnot, you do not want them to know about the story of Exodus. Let my people go and whatnot. That story's not for them.
Right. That's exactly right. Or Joseph, Joseph's story.
Mm-hmm.
About that story, though, it's, if you read the Old Testament, God went through some pretty elaborate lengths. He came up with a really elaborate plan to get his people into slavery in the first place so that he could rescue them and then demand to be praised for rescuing them. So, I mean, to me, that whole story is
he's kind of a dick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that characterization, though, of what happened, because it's like if you read John Walton's stuff, The Lost World of the Torah, he just points out that, like, a lot of the stuff that the translators give you, you got to be careful. Like whenever it says love God with all your mind, right? They didn't actually know what a mind was. They just said it's the word for guts, like go with what your gut says, right? So whenever it says that, God did something, it doesn't have the secondary and primary causation separation there. You only get it in certain passages, like when Joseph says to his brothers, you put me in slavery, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good to save a lot of people. He's just saying that God can even use the actions that are of evil people to bring about his goals. So I don't know. Sometimes I think when people see like God said or did so and so, they just think that it's some type of like primary action. Like when God says do this or you'll, be cursed or blessed. Walton points out this is like a doctor's prescription saying like, yeah, you won't have a heart attack if you take this medicine. But it's not like the doctor saying, if you don't take the medicine, then I'm going to zap you with a heart attack. And he's saying that's what the translators get wrong sometimes is they make it seem that way. So,
But he could do that with lots of other things, right? He prescribed punishments for doing certain things.
Well, yeah, you might remember my arguments more of like, so I think the biggest issue is like you have to understand from the beginning the kind of premise of what I'm arguing, right? Because what I'm arguing I don't take a fundamentalist view of the Bible. One of my critiques of atheists is that they actually do take they take what they grew up with as the view of the Bible. Not everybody, of course, but basically, if you look at these laws as like universal laws for all time, then yeah, I just agree with you guys. It's just I follow Walton and some of these other people who say like, of course not. Look at when the daughters of Zelophehad came to Moses and said, hey, why can't women inherit property? Just because our brothers died, we can't inherit our father's property? And then he asked God, and God's like, yeah, they're right. Give them the property. I just take it that
Okay, well, that's sort of off topic a lot. So, are you saying that you sort of believe in moral relativism?
So I believe that I believe basically that there is a deontic standard that's objective, but I just don't think that I think that God makes allotments to people based on where they're at. So they can't achieve perfection, right? So God makes allotments to where they're at, kind of like a drug addict. Think about it like this, like a drug addict that, is really bad on heroin or whatever. And but you love them, right? It's like your brother or somebody, right? But you love them. So you don't, if you say, look, you get off of it today or we're done, then a lot of times when people get off of heroin immediately, they'll die. So whenever you take them to a methadone clinic and or whatever it is, and give them an intermediate drug to come down, that's how I see God working with these people, saying, you don't need a king. And then being like, okay, they rejected me, give them a king and they'll see what they get out of it, kind of.
Yes, but God could do that with all kinds of things that were culturally relevant. Like he could do that with murder, he could do that with wearing of mixed threads, he could do that with all kinds of different things. But your sort of argument is he can't take them off slavery because they're dependent on it, like you said, of heroin and methadone. But that shouldn't ought to be the case because God did it with so many other cultural things. And you sort of saying, well, slavery is an exception. Why is it an exception? Why couldn't God do that?
Well, I don't think it's an exception. I agree with, I know people saying that I misquoted Josh in his book, but I agree with him in the book where he says that Leviticus 25 is actually abolishing or outlawing slavery for citizens. He just doesn't think it goes far enough because he doesn't think that that it outlaws it for non-citizens. But
if it doesn't outlaw it for non-citizens, it's not outlawing slavery. It's outlawing one class of slavery or enslaving a class of people within that society. Let's be honest here.
But not full abolition.
Exactly. That's not outlawing slavery because slavery is still an accepted practice within that society. I couldn't say, well, I'm outlawing drinking and then say, well, a certain class of people who own property can drink and the others can't. I'm not outlawing drinking in that case.
Sure, I agree with that, but we do have exceptions for foreigners still here as well. But you can think about foreigners today. If they marry somebody who's a U.S. citizen, they gain the rights of a U.S. citizen to become a citizen, for example, right? If you read Mark Glanville's paper about the refugee and the foreigner, he goes through all this and says, look, what happened to Ruth, what happened to all these people, they are becoming part of a household. And then I just wish people would read the book that Josh quoted in his book in one of the footnotes, Slave and Household in the Near East, Dr. Laura Culbertson. She just says that all this stuff about some people were, free and some people were slaves is all just a myth. The king was a slave. Every single person was what we're using this word slave. The problem is the words that we use for slave as
what word are you talking about?
Well, the king was a vassal of a higher lord.
Yeah. Well, not just a vassal, but he's supposed to be an ebed to God, right? So he can't even just pass his own laws, for example.
Correct. But as I was saying earlier, contextually things are really important. Exodus 21, where it says that if an owner of a bull, that bull gores an ebed, a slave or servant, the compensation is not paid to the victim. It's paid to the master. Yeah, and that's what we're talking about here. Owning somebody because their property, the compensation is paid to their master.
Yeah, I heard you say
you're
that.
No longer a real person. You're just farm equipment.
Yeah, I heard you say that, but I think that doesn't take into account a lot of the issues with that. So number one is like, whenever you said that the owner of the ox has to pay the owner of the slave, right? But the problem is that it doesn't say that. It says the owner of the ox has to pay the master of the slave. There's two different words used there. It's not the slave's not actually called. It's not called an owner for the person. One of them is Baal and one of them is Adonai.
Is that
So
a
one's a
distinction
Lord.
without a difference?
If there's a distinction without difference, why in the same verse do they use two different words? I wonder.
I mean, a lot of the Bible is written in verse with poetic speech. Perhaps the author of that particular section wanted to flavor up the vocabulary and didn't actually intend there to be a difference, which is why they used words with synonymous meanings.
So, Converse,
possible.
I'll have a response. When you're done your response, tell me, and then no skeptic say anything because I have a response responding to him. But Converse, all yours, or a super chat.
Yeah, and if you guys want to, just go on with the show as well without me, I don't want to,
Oh no!
But
So why
I
is
just
it
want to
throughout-
make sure. And no, wait. I'll let you ask as many questions as you want, Mark, but I have to at least show this. A $5 super chat from Disciple Day. Thank you so very much, Chris. Sending love out there. Though the spice is real, saying
Chris is being a
Christian
realist.
here, it does condone slavery. So what do you think? Not Converse?
yeah, I mean, I get this all the time, especially in the comment section of like, oh, I'm a Christian and I believe it. Like a lot of times I wonder, exactly who's saying it, but it doesn't matter because that's fine. There are Christian scholars who accept that the Bible condones slavery, and then they say like, yeah, God tolerated these people. Christ said that Moses was able to give laws because of how barbaric they were at the time. But I mean, what I'm saying is that, look, here's my entire argument. It's like, for fun, I like to go on and quote Dr. Josh's book on Discord to atheists when they talk about this topic. And I'll just quote it out of context and I'll say, what do you guys think about that? And they'll go, softening slavery. And I'll go, that's weird because it's from Dr. Josh's book. And then they'll go, well, I'm not saying he is, right? But it's just weird how when it comes from one perspective, it's no longer on the same level.
That's just an anecdote, mate. That's just an anecdote.
That's fine, but it's an anecdote.
Let me quote then. When examined the off-debate passage concerning the beating of slaves in Exodus 21, 20-21, as well as the verses 26 to 27, noting several things. First, the text was not intended to give laws that promoted the merciless beating of a slave. Against this, the evidence seems to suggest the laws were in place to prevent the master from abusing his slave. This does not, however, indicate the masters were not permitted or even encouraged to physically discipline their slaves with wooden rods, as this can be seen in both the passages in Exodus as well as in Proverbs. Finally, in the case of the goring ox that we were discussing, we examined the distinctions that were made between free persons and slaves, noting that slaves were not considered to be of equal value to free persons.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Joshua Bowen from his book.
Okay. Well, he also says in the book that this is one of the topics that atheists go way too far on, thinking that.
Did I go way too far?
Oh, no, you just read what he was saying. But
have I gone way too far? What did I say that was too far? Well, I mean, you're addressing me directly, so point out where I went too far.
Well, I'm not really addressing. I mean, you're just quoting what he said.
So you're sort of stating something that has got nothing to do with me as a sort of a general point. Why would you do that?
Well, you just brought up the fact that corporal punishment was normal in the ancient Near East, but we already know that.
I said it was normalized by the Bible.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Well, it's normal for the whole ancient world, even up until whenever I was young. I mean, like when I was young, corporal punishment was still popular. So
does that make corporal punishment right?
Of course not. That's not my argument.
So the Bible isn't morally right about corporal punishment.
I'm not saying that. Look, I'm not. It's like. Let me put it this way. I heard you guys say earlier, like, oh, well, there were secularists on the other side, like Darwin, for example. Well, I've got the Descent of Man here, and in the book, he actually says slavery was actually good at a time. It had its good uses at a time, for example.
Oh,
I could
I've
just
heard people
quote
make
that
the
out of
case
context.
that African slavery was good for the Africans because
no,
it
that's-
brought them
Yes.
to a Christian land.
Yeah, I think that's
terrible.
apologetics for slavery, to be honest with you, Converse. That's not
Oh,
really
that
something
is?
I would subscribe to.
Oh,
Well,
wait, that's
that
apologetics.
slavery
for
was good at
God.
the time because it wasn't good at the time.
No, I'm
There
not
was nothing
saying
good
that.
about it.
I'm saying in regards to what you're pointing out. You know, somebody pointed out earlier that Darwin was on the other
Okay.
side of this.
So this is a problem because I just pointed out that, what I've said so far, and sort of you're talking to me, and I've pointed out where Dr. Josh has said that the owners were permitted and even encouraged to beat their slaves kind of thing. And then you've pointed out, oh, well, atheists take it too far. And then you sort of say, well, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about other atheists, which doesn't address what I've said. And then I point out,
You didn't say anything I
you haven't,
with.
hang on. I pointed out you didn't address what I've said. And then you're going to, oh, well, some people say that slavery was good. Your whataboutism is incredible. You're going to anywhere but actually addressing what I'm saying.
That's because you didn't say anything that I should be addressing. All you did was quote that corporal punishment was normal.
I asked you a question. I said, does that mean that that it is corporal punishment is moral?
No, I said
and then
no.
you said no. And then I said, does that mean that the Bible promoted something immoral?
No.
No. So at the time it was moral, but it's not moral anymore.
No, look, this is my view on this, right? I don't think corporal punishment works, okay? It doesn't mean that it's immoral or anything. It might be. I'm not sure. I mean, it just depends on the case, like a whooping or something, okay? But whenever Josh was asked by Derek on Myth Vision, you can watch it, about this, and Derek says, he said, Josh says that, it's the same as like for their children. It was the same punishment that the children got. And Derek goes, but let's be honest, the slaves got worse punishment, right? And he goes, no, across the board in the ancient Near East, it was the exact same punishment. In fact, the slaves are kind of, like children in that sense. They're treated the same. In fact,
children had very little protections under law for a long time. That's true.
I also just want to say,
bear the rod, spoil the child. I don't think that's a good moral lesson at all. Because have you seen a rod? Could I show you what a rod is? The rod and the staff.
Perfect knowledge
of what a rod is.
Humans don't. Why couldn't God have? Wouldn't God have known? Because even you said you don't think corporal punishment is effective. You don't think it's right. But why couldn't God have taken a stand on this? Why did he have to just go with whatever ancient man thought?
Well, that's what I was saying. From you have to understand where I'm coming from on this, because everybody likes to go back to if this is God's morals or whatever, and I don't think that. Like I said, I think that this is just God's trying to work with people, and then they're not doing what he says. So I was like, okay, let them fall into that trap and see what happens then, right?
But he doesn't do that for anything else.
He didn't work with people about homosexuality. He said put them to death. He didn't say, people are going to be gay, so just work with them. No, he said execute them.
Well, there are some
people have been gay for ages. Well,
there are some authors that actually,
or at least decades. What are we talking about?
Can I just quickly? Can you just show my screen very quickly?
I feel bad, Mark, to keep on using you. Just give me 1 second to.
Use me, baby. Use me.
Oh my! And that's right. First of all, I agree with Ember that this is sponsored not exactly by Dr. Josh, but the men I am paying to make pictures of him. Number two, that Sinister Porpoise with a $2 super chat. Is Aron Ra going to set his mic free now? Ooh.
So, as we were discussing earlier, Aron's mic is actually a rescue. He adopted it.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you just share my screen quickly so we can understand what a rod is when we're talking about the
giggity,
and this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mark, which is that as much as we would love to have Converse here, we do have his friend and his brother with us. And so if you would like to debate or get, in fact, a friend, we're looking for creationists. We are looking for people that actually agree with the position that the Bible does not support slavery. And so if you would like to come on, we'll give you as much time as well. Come one, come all, the pool is fine. I saw Sea Science out there. I know there are a few others that, definitely think that the Bible is A-okay with slavery anyway. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Mark. You wanted to share.
Yeah, just quickly. I'll just show where your Shabbat is. Okay, so this is a rod and staff that the Bible talks about. There are sheep herding or goat herding implements that you hit the sheep with the shavat or the rod, and you basically grab them around the neck or legs with the staff. It's very useful for shepherds. But this is the rod. It's not like a very tiny little thing or something like that. This could inflict serious trauma on people. So what we're talking about with spare the rod, spoil the child, is that you would hit your child with this thing like a rod. And it's a club, basically. Yeah. It is a club. It's not like a equal length rod. It is a sort of handle that has an enlarged end that you would hit the sheep with. And yeah, it wouldn't really damage the sheep because they're sheep, but it would certainly do some damage on a person. And this is the passage where, you can beat your slave with the rod kind of thing. Which is Exodus 21. I'm not sure what verse it is, to be honest with you, but it definitely is in there. Anyone that beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Now, the amount of trauma you could inflict with that rod, even if someone recovers in a day or two, I think is kind of gross. I get that you said a whooping, Converse, and like a whooping is moral. I don't think that's moral either. I don't think you should whoop your children.
I don't think he was endorsing it. I think he was just drawing a distinction, maybe. Even though
you said maybe they deserve a whooping is what your exact words are. I don't think.
No, I didn't.
No, okay,
I said we can.
Stream.
Yeah, it's fine. I didn't say they deserved it. I said maybe spankings are wrong, or maybe they're not. I'm not sure because I'm not familiar enough with the data and stuff on that and how it affects people and stuff. Whatever. I'm just giving that I don't care about it. For the sake of this discussion, I can just say that it's wrong, for example. But the point is that when you look at the points that the scholars make about this, passages like this one, right? It's not that you can beat your children, because that was the norm, that you could, that they got punishment. But what they point out is what this is saying, that if they die, if you knock out a tooth or an eye, the servant goes free, because of a tooth or an eye, for example. Because what does that mean? That means you were swinging for the head, right? The point of these things are to regulate what's actually occurring with people, is that they're being abusive rather than using some type of corrective action. They're actually using it as a form of punishment and a deeper sense of revenge. And that's what the laws are saying that's wrong.
Do you think it's acceptable to use a rod for corrective action?
No, I mean, not by today's standards, for sure. It was then.
Why would today's standards be any different than standards previously?
Because circumstances, I guess.
Well, that's moral relativism.
Yeah, so I actually take a virtue ethics view for people. I think that they're, like I said before, it might be a little bit difficult for some people to understand what I'm saying, but look, if the objective standard is perfection, right? But people can't live up to a perfect standard, and ought implies can, then it just is the case that they can't do that. So it's not that they ought do it in that sense. So there's going to be a more contextual standard for them if God's going to work with them at all. Otherwise, he should just get rid of them because they can't do the perfect thing all the time.
I don't really like perfection. It's problematic in a number of different ways. Mainly adaptability. If something is perfect, it can't adapt by definition. So you may have a perfect standard in one specific circumstance, but when things change, you're trying to apply that perfect standard to a situation it's not perfect for. It's in a way, it's very much like biological evolution. You might be perfectly evolved for living in the Levant, and then you move to Norway, and you're going to die unless you adapt really damn quick. So I don't think perfection is actually perfect, except in that one tiny little niche.
Yeah, so I
Yeah,
mean,
and
I
I
agree basically with
think,
what you're saying, but you
well,
have
I think
the
that,
issue is
go,
when, yeah. Should you want to
sorry,
go
go
on or
ahead.
should I
Go ahead.
respond to it?
No, go Converse. Go.
Okay, just to respond to that. So when you think about perfection, right, you need to think about if God's perfect, that means that he's complete in every great making property. So, like for example, honesty. Let's take that for example. If you're perfectly honest, you never lie. So you don't need to be there's no circumstance in which you have to adapt to your, circumstances and lie. But people who are limited end up in circumstances where they might need to or want to lie, right? Or if you're perfectly, whatever you just named the trait, and that's why I'm saying that people can't live up to that all the time, and that's why I don't even look. I think you guys should agree with me. You should read the Bible and see in Exodus chapter 2 where when the Pharaoh tells the midwives to kill the Hebrew children when they come out of the womb, and they don't do it, and they lie and say, "Wait, look, it's because the Hebrew women aren't like our women. The babies come before we even get there," and God rewards them for that, right? So it's a fundamentalist that says, like, look, lying's always wrong in every context. It's just like, well, what happened there? God rewarded them for that, right?
Yeah. So first thing, because you're sort of going on from point to point to point, and you've gone off to something in Egypt now. So I want to bring it back because you've sort of said that God's working within the sort of limits of the time that they were in and working with that. But the problem is that there's a whole load of other things that people were doing on the time that God prescribed very harsh punishments for, like picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And we knew that was going on because there is a story of Moses being told by God to stone to death someone that picked up sticks. So obviously that was going on. Obviously people were stealing things. Obviously there was murder going on. There was a lot of things going on that God did not have a problem prescribing against. So the idea that he has to work with the time for slavery, yet didn't for any of the other things that were going on, is special pleading. And might I remind you, if you're going to Egypt, that God also forced Pharaoh to change his mind multiple times about letting the people go, and then killed every firstborn male of anything in the entire land, of slaves, of servants, of animals, for some reason, as a punishment for the decision that God made.
Yeah, I don't even remember your first point now because you brought this up, but I disagree with this.
Well, you brought up both points, like you were talking about how God rewarded people in Egypt for doing something.
Well, that was about lying.
Just...
Yeah, it's not about Egypt specifically; it's about lying. But on this latter point, no. So that's what I made. That's what I said earlier. Like if you read Dr. McGregor's book, for example, you'll see that he points out that the Bible doesn't use the language primary and secondary causation. So whenever it says that God did such and such, right? Well, sometimes it clarifies in a later verse that it wasn't that God primarily did this; it's that he let that the person's actions brought about a goal, and he was able to foresee it and use it for that purpose, even though it's not what he would have done.
And no skeptic can respond because we're getting him in for everybody in Skeptic and Ranting is a win. But when we have Pat Lowinger, what is up? We are Skeptic and Ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery. Hope you're doing well.
I do want to respond to that, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Pat.
Hi, Pat.
Hey,
I'm here for comedy. That's it.
Hooray.
Well, just give me 1 second, Mark, and I'll hand
that
it
was
right
my
back
job,
over.
Pat.
The topic, the debate, anything we've been talking about, Pat, feel free to chime in.
I was just going to say that, when we talk about slavery in the ancient world, we're talking about a normative practice. It's finding cultures that didn't practice slavery is actually, I think, the quest that many historians are doing, because we really don't have any. How those systems were developed within various societies, somewhat, there's variation here, variation there, but ultimately slavery was a societal institution among ancient peoples. And so when you look at it that way, nothing special in Israel, in ancient Israel.
Well, sure, yeah, but sort of, I think our
work.
point is that the Bible still supports that institution and sort of is pro-slavery, really.
Absolutely, no different than the Romans promoted slavery in
right, absolutely.
The 12 tables.
And the Romans probably had worse slavery than the Israel did. So,
but see, that I actually think that it's arguments like that, Mark, that show that it's much more nuanced than that. I mean,
okay,
we can argue that, but I think ultimately, if you make that argument, you'd have to say, when are we looking at ancient Israel and when are we looking at ancient Rome? There was a time in ancient Rome that I would say was much better than ancient Israel, right? So, what decade or what century we're going to look at, but largely, I don't think one was necessarily better than the other. I think they had different social components associated with them. Again, if you want to say, Israel was better, I actually think I could argue effectively that depending on the time period I choose from ancient Israel and the time period I choose from Rome, I could actually prove the counterpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for example, I think that some parts of the early scripture before the what Bowen calls the development happened, I believe that could be potentially the case. But I do think that there are later points after the developments that happen where, for example, slavery is outlawed for citizens completely, and you can only take them as hired workers, where there is nothing in the rest of the ancient Near East that is comparable to that, where it was outlawed for citizens.
When did Romans ever allow citizens to be taken as slaves?
They never did.
They never did. And actually, a Roman would have to be criminally charged, lose his citizenship to be able to be subjected into slavery. There was a formal process for Romans. So a Roman citizen, particularly in the late Republican Empire, could not be reduced to slave status outside of legal proceeding.
Yeah,
you're a citizen or a slave.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, that's not the case, because if you're a slave and your child's born into they're a citizen. But they're still, according to what some people would say, a slave, because they're born as a citizen doesn't mean that they relinquish their slave.
What do you mean? In Rome, if they're born to a slave, they're not a citizen.
No, they were a slave.
You do gain status through
no
freeman status.
Freeman status was completely different legal distinction than slave in the ancient world. Romans had multiple forms of what we'd call social and legal hierarchies, right? Citizenship was, depending on what time of the Roman Empire we're talking about, was specifically reserved for certain people. At later time, there were Latin affiliates. You had Latin rights, which was a reduced form of citizenship. Then you had freemen. Until Caracalla in 212 largely extends citizenship to the entire Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was highly stratified based on which legal distinction you fit into, and slaves were definitely always at the bottom of that legal distinction.
Are you making a distinction between slave and servant there, I guess? So you think that, for example, citizens can be serfs, right?
Serfs? Well, are you serfs is a medieval term. Are you talking about?
Well, serfdom is used in the ancient Near East literature as well, though.
But we're talking about ancient Rome, right?
Yeah,
ancient Rome.
Yeah, Rome doesn't develop a serf state until the Byzantine era, probably 5th, 6th century. And that's when they start reducing the number of slaves they have. The only two, what we call slave regions in Rome, where slavery was a predominant, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population, is Italy proper and Sicily. Outside of those two regions in the ancient Roman Empire, the rate of slavery was much lower. There was social and economic factors as well. But like say in what is modern France today, then ancient Roman Gaul, slavery was probably no more than 10%, more likely between 5 and 8% of the total population. So regionally throughout the Roman world, we can track, what was the percentage slave population in a given region at a given time. But, the only place we'd say that they were slave societies was in Italy proper and Sicily proper at certain time periods where they got into these.
Sorry, go ahead, Pat.
I'm just saying because we look at regions, there were economic reasons for slavery as societal institutions in those regions, given the length of their conquest, how they were conquered, and the economic systems that formed there.
Do we know that because of the records that the Romans keep really good records? I've heard
it's right. Archaeology. There's a lot of things that go into it, but ultimately, we look at ancient records, and for example, during the first century, we see a lot of prohibitions against how many slaves can be manumitted because Romans in Italy were possibly manumitting too many slaves. Like a landlord or a slave owner would, at their death, manumit too many slaves, and so they were going, once manumitted, they became freemen, and that freeman had a certain legal status, and there were issues with, quote unquote, there being too many ex-slaves in Roman society and what roles they were going to perform. So there were prohibitions against how many free slaves certain Romans could do.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not sure. Do you know Del Martin from Yale? He wrote a book called "Salvation as Slavery as Salvation." He did that Yale lecture series on YouTube that's so popular. I'm not sure if you know him, but
I'm familiar with his work.
Okay, yeah, he did a dissertation, I believe, on Roman slavery, and just from like reading his book and like listening to that lecture series, it sounded a lot worse than what you're saying here. But maybe he's focusing on one specific area.
What part of it sounded worse?
Well, from what he was saying is slavery, normal as anything. Normal as any institution you can think of, capitalism, whatever. Even when you're slaves, you had the peculium where slaves could, even after being freed, they can do business as clients and so forth. But basically, it was all about patronage. So even like the more, upper class, or not upper class, the upper class would be patrons to like lower class, but they're still like serfs that are, serving the state and so forth, and these menial jobs and things, like that kind of thing.
There was a form of patronage. Many freed slaves that were manumitted remained under the general purview of the people that had freed them. But there was also a responsibility too. By the way, when you freed a slave, you were responsible for the future conduct as their patron. So a slave that was freed and then started doing a bunch of criminal activity, that reflected negatively both socially and legally in Roman society. So there was responsibility to those that you manumitted.
Would they fine you or make you
the damages? At different times, again, which decade of the Roman Empire we're talking about? At certain times, it becomes where masters are legally required to make sure their slaves, quote unquote, their ex-slaves, don't get into trouble. And so I think when you say, when we look at slavery as an institution within societies, we need to look at those societies, look at them broadly, then in certain narrow contexts for more detailed analysis. But, the Roman system of slavery was awful, but it was a system of slavery that was much like many of the others in the ancient world. There are no good forms of slavery in the ancient world. In my opinion.
Well, one thing that I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, they just are what they are. They were
One point that he made that I would get your take on, because you sound like you're familiar with that, Roman, is he said that basically what they would do kind of with this patron thing is they would somebody who's a non-citizen who became a household servant would kind of rise up through he said it's the only way for upward mobility in the Roman Empire would be to become a slave and to kind of rise up and promise to show people that you're responsible and that you do what you're supposed to do and so forth. And like you said, the patron would like take you under their wing and kind of like, instead of being at a dock, over a long way away, he would send this person, but he could only sign documents if he freed him. So then they started this thing where like he would free him, and then he could go sign documents and so forth. And he could even get this money called the peculium, which is like a profit, and he could spend it himself and so forth. And so anyway, he was pointing out that it was kind of like a type of adoption where you could take these people in and move them upward in the chain of mobility. Do you kind of agree with that?
That's one mechanism, but not the only mechanism. There were a lot of avenues for social mobility in the Roman Empire. A lot of it depended on what class and status you were born into, but ultimately the goal was to achieve at some point Roman citizenship. That was the creme de la creme in the ancient Roman world.
Did you get
Well,
that
my
from the
understanding
military
is
service?
that former slaves could never be a Roman citizen. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's true. They can gain freeman status, and freeman status there were certain protections for that, but they definitely were not the equivalent of again, someone with either Latin citizenship right or Roman citizenship right. They're two different distinctions at different times. At a certain point, Latin
Playing wordscapes only 10 minutes
Latin,
a day sharpens your brain.
then later become what we call generally Roman citizenship.
And,
That's a really good impression you did there.
and I am actually going to add in Disciple Day, getting on another Christian.
We'll have a question for Converse when you've got time.
Oh, and then I know you have something to say in a second, Rubrics. Let me just give me 1 second. Now I feel bad. Rubrics, did you have a last thing to say?
And I was just gonna clarify because I took Latin for 7 years. But it's been a while. That's why I was confirming. Because Pat seems to be an expert in that type of thing. That's all.
Oh wow, you took Latin for 7 years?
Yep, 4 in high school, 3 in college. I minored in it.
Made an exorcism. I'll give you a call, Rubric.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
Officially my hero now.
It's crazy, yeah.
Translated the Aeneid twice.
No way, really. There's something interesting. A scholar that I have interviewed a few times that I really like. He has written a book about Luis de Molina, and he says that he's one of the only Reform era church fathers that hasn't been all his works translated because his Latin prose is like one of the most difficult that you could ever think of, and I bet it'd be interesting to read for you.
It's been a hot minute since I've tried.
Converse, do you think that sort of the Romans having all of this legislation around slavery and how they move around and what happens with them, do you think that would make the culture pro-slavery?
That the culture would be pro-slavery?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar enough to know if they're pro-slavery. So I mean, I'd have to know exactly what their, intent was.
But I'm also hold on one second. Disciple Day, we are skeptic and ranting.
Chris, thank you.
On is the Bible pro-slavery? And what are your thoughts about the debate, the topic, or anything we can talk about tonight? Might have pulled him in while I can't believe you would say something so amazing and so honorable. We'll wait on you. But Mark, I felt bad then for interrupting you. We'll wait for Disciple. Is there something on your mind?
Okay. Well, would you say that the laws and regulations around slavery would help normalize it for the citizens?
Would help normalize it?
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, if it was normal, there's no need to necessarily regulate it. I'm saying if you're pro something, there's no you might want to regulate it, but regulating it seems like there's some type of issue with it, and so that's why.
I'm going to give you this analogy. The state of Washington has a Department of Transportation. They have rules and regulations regarding how vehicles move on the roadway, regulations on ownership, registration, regarding how, commerce will be conducted on a roadway. Is the state of Washington pro ownership of a vehicle or pro travel by car?
No.
Why would you say that? So the state uses funds and dictates legislation to regulate and promote these activities. Why wouldn't you think they're pro this activity?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Who builds roads? Do you privately build roads?
The state.
The state does,
right? Some people do, but I don't.
Right. So the state is pro travel and commerce, right?
Well, no, because the state also spends money to, have courts and legislation drawn up and stuff over divorce. But
you don't
doesn't mean they're pro
commerce.
Sorry, that doesn't mean they're pro divorce.
They're pro divorce is a legal option, are they not?
Yeah, but they're pro marriage.
But no. They're
Because it
pro-marriage
benefits
as
the
they're
state.
pro-marriage as a legal option, and they're equally pro-divorce as a legal option, right?
Well, that just means that they're not pro either. If they're equal options.
If it's not prohibited, then it's implicitly permitted, is it not?
Well, that's not the case. Well, no. If it's not inhibited, yeah, it's permitted but not promoted.
Does the state regulate marriage?
The state regulates marriage, yes.
Right. So they don't just let you marry whoever you want, right? The answer is no, they don't. Right.
They don't?
So right, you can't marry your first cousin, right? In many states, right?
Oh, okay.
You can't marry people under a
Gotcha.
certain age and designation, right? So the state
That's
has
like
a vest.
in many states. We're
In some
South.
states, yeah.
Right. And so the state has an vested interest in the promotion of marriage under certain legal conventions, right?
Mm-hmm. But not,
And-
yeah.
And so,
Not
but that doesn't apply to ancient slavery in the ancient world, right? So when we
Wait.
say societies enact laws and regulate things, they're not promoting it. That's your argument, though.
And then Converse, you have the final word, but try not to make it a question so I can bring Disciple Day back in.
Yeah, it's like whenever I told Dr. J. Cavallero, I said that, people are saying that because, the Bible allowed for or regulated, certain institutions of like slavery, that that means that it actually promotes it. And he's like, what? No, the Bible, the U.S. government regulates divorce, but they don't promote divorce. They just allow for it.
No, they promote it as a
No, they
form
don't.
of legal separation, right?
No, they don't promote it.
No, yeah, no.
They allow
Oh
for
yeah,
it.
they do.
No, they allow
So
for it.
the state promotes divorce as an alternative to
No, they
anything else that goes on. So,
Correct.
for instance, living in a marriage that you do not want to be into, staying in that marriage, domestic violence and things like that, they actively promote divorce over any of those other options.
No, the state doesn't promote divorce. It allows for it.
And on that note, I will say we have about 45 minutes to an hour left of open mic before we go into outros, but we're going to bring in Disciple Day. We are skeptic and ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? Someone was, I forget who pointed it out, but they're like, it's not even midnight yet anywhere in the United States. It's midnight somewhere. And I'm sending so much love to Disciple Day. We are skeptic and ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? Welcome on board. And what are your thoughts about the topic, the debate, anything we talk about?
First of all, hello everyone. I got to be honest about something. I always come in already with my tail between my legs because you guys this gets so over my head so quick. I appreciate you putting up with someone like me. I really do. I mean, I enjoy it, and sometimes I can track. But when you can talk about the history and stuff, you guys are just well-read, better educated than I am in many areas. So forgive me that. But yeah, I think, like I said in the chat, I think I've never read the Bible and thought it doesn't promote slavery. Like that never occurred to me reading the Bible that it didn't promote slavery. Like it seems like I don't know even how we get there. So maybe I can ask, because if not Converse, is someone, I haven't heard anyone really say it flat out doesn't, right? Are we saying it doesn't promote slavery?
Yeah, I think that it doesn't promote slavery. In fact, whenever I asked Dr. Josh, did he think it did? He said no, that it didn't. I played that clip for Dillahunty, and he said I took him out of context. Then Dr. Josh did a little review with Oz, and in it, Oz said, so he's saying that you don't think about promotes slavery. It's kind of, and he goes, no, I just don't think it does. It allowed for it. And, even some verses you might say that it, seems like, it's fine with it, but it does actually outlaw it for citizens and so forth. So I don't think it does. He clarified live.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I know what I believe and what I've read. I didn't come in. I had the privilege. I know it's not the same for everyone, but coming in the first time reading the Bible, and not really knowing anything or what I was to expect from it. So, so when I read it, and still when I read it, it looks like it promotes slavery.
You want the same thing from an M. Night Shyamalan movie? Just pointing that out.
You want the what?
You want the same exact thing from an M. Night Shyamalan. Just come in not knowing anything.
Yeah. So I like some of his better than some of his others. I did enjoy Cabin in the Woods. Wasn't that?
Okay.
Yeah, or Knock on the Door, or whatever it was. Sorry, not Cabin in the Woods. That was a different movie, but
good one though.
I mean, I think
still a good movie. Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't. I don't know totally. And again, I'm not a scholar on anything, but if the Bible really doesn't have an overall view that viewing people as property is wrong. I mean, it seems like it's in a lot of exchanges in the Bible, right? Like husbands and wives, like it seems like an exchange of property. I think there was like an exchange of property. And I mean, parents and children, like, it's like something like if your kids are a curse to you, kill them, right? Take them out and stone them. Like that seems pretty much like property ship. Like, doesn't it? I mean, it does to me. And even an illustration of like when Abraham is going to sacrifice Isaac at the command of God, and Isaac doesn't. I mean, Abraham doesn't say, "Well, I think I should get Isaac's opinion on it first." Right? It seems like he
should have had a poll.
It just seems pretty clear that God's view on it's a little different. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I thought you were finished.
Well, I mean, it just, again, everywhere I read, it just seems like that's not really a problem in I'll say the kingdom view, right? Is using my Christianese, is like that. It's a problem that people are property, and I think it is concerned with the treatment of people, and there we can have disagreements about what's right, what's fair, and what's, But as far as I can see, the ultimate picture of it is that we are in fact God's prized possessions, proper. So there's a sense in which we're the children of God, and I believe that as a Christian, of course, and that we're also the possession of God, His property, and He's jealous for us. And so I don't see that proposition as a whole would be offensive, that people are property. And so again, I could be wrong. Certainly, I'm not a scholar. But so it solves the problem for me in the one sense. Now, certainly we can argue about, is that right? But it solves the argument for me in one sense, in that I don't have to rectify even what type of slavery we're talking about. Because if the core, at least for me, again, the core understanding of slavery is owning someone else as your personal property. What you choose to do with them at that point can be debated as to what's good and not. But I don't think the Bible takes offense to the point of ownership.
Okay. Well, like a few of the examples you brought up, like Abraham and his son, right? Abraham didn't have a Bible. He was before there was ever a Moses or anybody, right? So he's just a pagan from the Chaldee or the Chaldees, and so God just takes him and says, "Okay, I'll take this guy and make a nation out of him." And He tells him, "Come with leave your forefather's house." And where you're at, and go to a land I'll show you. He basically tells them to just pack up and be a foreigner, and I'll show you where you're going at some point. Like it's so it's not like Abraham was like this guy that we're supposed to think was always good. I mean, he lied.
Well, I'm sorry. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's not the point I'm making. I don't. I'm not even talking about the Abraham story. I think it's just consistent throughout the Bible.
Well, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because I think that all the foundational stories of the Bible really are like, for example, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. And he's like, "Oh, you did this for evil, but God meant it for good, because I saved a ton of people from this famine, becoming second in charge in Egypt, and so forth." And then they get enslaved in Egypt, all the Israelites. And then God says, "Let my people go." And He bails them out and takes them, gives them a land of Israel and so forth. So I just don't think so. I think that all the foundational stories are
you think God took offense? Let's just say, forgive my wording. You think God took offense at the point of ownership or at the point of abuse?
Well,
I'm curious. Simply, I'm just being asked. Was he offended at the point of was he offended at the point at which the Egyptians, Pharaoh, whoever you want to say or whatever, said, "These people are now our people, they're under my rule"? Or do you think it was the point of abuse where he said, "And I'm going to be a cruel and abusive dictator, I'm going to force them to do this stuff"? At what point was the offense? And I'm not claiming that certain slavery is right and certain is not. That's not my point. I'm trying to say that I don't think the problem was at the ownership thought.
Well, I don't think that the people owned anything. in the ancient world. Like, I mean,
They owned people.
If you're no, I don't think so. Yeah, if you read like Laura Culbertson stuff, like a lot of the stuff that like is like even in the literature when they say owned, right, they'll end up saying or holded and things like that, because when you look, for example, at the Leviticus chapter 25, where people always say like, well, yeah, it says literally that, that they're going to, these people are your property, right? But the word that's used there for property, God specifically says in that same chapter, you don't own the akuzah. The akuzah is mine. You are merely foreigners in my land, right?
Well, it says their money, actually. Yeah. It says their money.
No, but I think
so their wealth. That the word translates as money or wealth.
No, akuzah doesn't. It translates as inheritance. But God tells them they don't.
How is that better?
Forgive me, not Converse. I think I'm not doing well at making my point. So forgive me. I think the overarching idea there is still remains that God has ownership of His people, and it seems to be the clear to me Christian narrative. So much so that we're described as being set free from sin and become slaves to God, slaves to righteousness. Like that's the whole thing to me. Like that's the whole idea. And so to me, it looks like God, again, the Bible, when I say the Bible, I mean, I'm interpreting that as the word of God. So I understand it wasn't around in Abraham's time or even Jesus's time or any of the time, but is that the heart of God, let's say, does promote it. Now, just because it's promoted, I'm not making the claim that it's inherently good, which is because you brought up that, enslaving the Jews, was meant for evil. So I'm not claiming it's inherently good, but I'm saying it does seem to be promoted. And I just, again, I can't, so many places in the Bible, people don't have rights. And if they don't have rights except under other people, they're owned. I mean, I don't see how you can get around it.
Yeah,
if it's promoted. When you capture another people, you own them. I mean, it's like, it'd be like me trying to be like, well, the Bible has never promoted war. It's like, well, come on, really? That doesn't make sense. It just does. And so I'm not against you, just so you know. Remember, I'm a Christian. I'm just confused by this thought. It doesn't occur to me like that. And then I feel like I end up fighting the wrong battle because I'm trying to convince people there's a good type of slavery and a bad type of slavery, or less slavery or more slavery, and then I'm going to for me, again, as a Christian, it's fine for anyone, but I'm going to a bunch of extra biblical stuff to try and make it work. And like, oh man, well, maybe during this period, these slaves, and this period, these slaves, and maybe chattel slaves. And maybe, this is all over my head. I only know half of what you guys are even talking about, but like the Bible, I just don't, man, I'm having so much trouble tracking that non-converse. And again, I'm a Christian. I assume you are. I didn't hear, so maybe you're not, but I can't get around that in the Bible. And I just, and so I feel like we're having the wrong debate.
No, I get it.
We end up trying to convince people who don't believe that slavery had its purpose or was good, or in a human sense, like in a physical sense. Like, what a crazy thing. Like somebody brought it up, maybe it was better than Ember. Somebody brought up the idea that, well, certainly some good came out of slavery when you talk about the North Atlantic slave or whatever it was. It's like, and we look at different slaves and say, certainly some good came out of it. It's like, well, good comes out of all disaster. I mean, that you could say that. I can tell you people who could tell you personally, and I'm not even talking spiritually, okay, for the skeptics among us, which I am one. Personally, some good things came out of 9/11 for them. It's true. It's just a fact. And now that doesn't mean 9/11 was good. I'm not at all saying it was good, but good comes out of tragedies.
Halliburton had a good time.
For sure.
Well, yeah. So good comes out of tragedy. That happens. And I believe that's because of the grace of God. We can all disagree here, but that's not what the topic is.
The problem is that if somebody says the Bible promotes slavery, right? If it promotes something, right, it's fine with it. It's good, right? Why doesn't outlaw it for citizens?
It doesn't. It doesn't. The thing is, if I say the Bible, for me not to say the Bible promotes slavery because it doesn't sound good. For me, I'm not saying for you, because I totally believe you're completely convicted and believe that the Bible does not promote it. But if I were to come out and say, well, slavery's not good, and therefore I'm going to say the Bible doesn't promote it when I believe the Bible does. And by the way, this doesn't make me pro-slavery. I'm talking about what the Bible says, so just so we can't be confused.
Sure.
But it just so clearly does.
No, really? So why does Paul say, like, gain your freedom if you can, but if you're a slave when you're called to the Lord, don't let it worry you, but avail yourself of the opportunity if you can?
Well, so what I don't understand that seems to me to be a sensible statement Paul's making. If you can be free, be free.
Mm-hmm. But
if you can't behave, right? I mean, we don't have to like that statement, but that's what he's saying. So what? Yeah, I take no offense to that statement, and I don't see. I'm not making the argument that people would want to be slaves. That seems to be what you're confusing me saying. Like, if people want to be slaves, then then I get why Paul's argument would be striking, because, but I'm not making that argument. I'm saying the Bible condones it.
Slavery is used in so many passages as a negative, but it promotes it. And I'm like, I'm having a problem seeing that. If you want to say that it condoned it, like it allowed for it, all these things, I'm like, okay, I can see that. But if you want to go further and say that it promotes,
doesn't the Bible forbid?
Hang on. Didn't Paul also
Sorry.
write Ephesians, which sort of says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, just as you would obey Christ"?
Yeah, he did. Have you ever read any commentaries on what he might have meant by that?
Well, how do they know?
Yeah. So when you read like scholars, like Roman scholars, like Del Martin, right, at Yale, and there's others, but they say, look, Paul and his letters, from the context that's being used, Paul is not in a position to change the law. He is a Hebrew amongst the Romans. No, they're living under Roman rule. And so Paul is telling people, don't do what these other Hebrews who are rebels thinking that the Second Temple period, we're supposed to fight the Romans like the.
Well, if I could interrupt all of you, because you gave a good question back to Dave Gar, who asked, please ask Pat how an ancient one proved free man status. So Pat, sounded like you were about to say something, but that.
So basically, by not being a slave, remember, slaves at different times were distinguished differently in Roman society, but the most common was the slave collar, which was something you couldn't easily remove. There was also branding. So basically, if you didn't have a collar or a brand, it was pretty easy to determine that you were a freeman. Given the lack of literacy, also there was regional distinction as well. So, for example, you're living in what is modern Bulgaria, ancient Thrace. People in your town would know who the slaves were and who the free people were. And people didn't travel a lot, but when they did, they made sure to, when they took slaves, they made sure slaves were readily distinguished as such, and then free people and then citizens did so as well. So it was more of a not being identified as a slave made you either a freeman or a citizen. Citizens often had paperwork they could carry and show, particularly militarily discharged people that received citizenship. They actually had diplomas showing citizenship, and there was there were Roman rolls on who had citizenship, and you could check this out. And the one thing you didn't want to do is claim you were a citizen when you weren't, because if you got found out, you were arrested and said, "No, but I'm a citizen," and you weren't. There was very bad ramifications for that. So, and again, only people that could claim citizenship were citizens, and then that was verified. Freemen didn't have that right.
So what would we think of somebody that told the antebellum slaves, obey your masters, even the harsh ones? What would we think of that person? Would that be a good person?
During that time, I don't know. It depends on what their intent was, I guess. So, like these types of questions that don't actually have any content to them. Like, I think that's part of the issue with the conversation is whenever I cite what scholars say about the context here, then you want to change the context.
Well, but you're citing. You seem to be relying on like one or two scholars, right? So like I mean, there are a lot out there.
How many scholars have you guys cited?
I haven't cited any, but I if you want me to, I'll be more than happy to.
Yeah, sure. I would love to see that another scholar saying the opposite of that, that's qualified.
Yeah, I'm asking some difficult questions, Converse, and they are difficult
I don't
questions.
think
Well,
they're
I would
relevant.
I would cite Scheidel from Oxford talking about the particular passages. What two things you left out of your analysis is, one, you keep talking about Paul solely as being a Hebrew, but Paul was also what else? He was a Roman citizen, right? So if you believe Acts, if we follow Acts, then one thing Paul had to make sure he didn't do, because he would have been executed for doing it, was fomenting servile insurrection. There were laws in ancient Rome about telling slaves to seek freedom outside of the legally allowable options. So that's why Paul says, if you can gain your freedom, do it. If not, be resolved to your task. Because to say anything else, to say, hey, slaves should seek freedom, and period, would have been servile insurrection.
Exactly.
Right?
That's what I argue.
Caveat. Well, right, but this is the point is, there's also a context that Paul was operating into, because to do anything else other than what Paul said would have been legally non-feasible for a new religious movement that was trying to distinguish itself as being subject to the state and separated from those that were seeking to go against the state, right?
So if you know the context of the Hasmonean dynasty, where in the Second Temple period, Judas Maccabeus, his father, rose up against the state to lead the Jews to fight the Romans. Then after that occasion, everyone thought the Messiah would come and all the Jews would band together and fight and destroy the Romans, where Paul and Christ and these others were saying, no. Christ said, you're making my father's house a den of rebels, actually. It's not thieves. And so forth. And so Paul, whenever he's saying this, he's saying, look, don't give us a bad name amongst these
Judas
Romans.
Maccabeus didn't lead an insurrection against. Yeah, but he didn't lead an insurrection against Rome. He led an insurrection against the Seleucids.
Which is one of the Roman.
Nope. You're about 200 years off, buddy.
Are you sure about that?
The Seleucids are the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, which was one of Alexander the Great's generals who, when Alexander Kingdom broke up, they took the eastern portions of the province. They were ultimately defeated by the Romans, by the way.
Should I be
just want to say something. I just want to say something on this, because you've sort of acknowledged that Paul said these things because he was afraid of the consequences from the Roman Empire. And that's fine. I get that. Like, there are consequences to promoting slaves to rebel. But in doing so, it doesn't matter what his reason is. That passage still promotes being obedient to your master. It doesn't matter why he did it. It doesn't matter that he would have gotten into trouble if he said anything other. But then you do have to wear that the Bible promotes slaves being obedient. You have to just wear that.
Yeah, it does, though, doesn't it?
Okay, so... Yeah, so all you're saying is like, either that you're saying that he should have done otherwise and told them to rebel.
No, I'm not saying, look, I don't believe in a God, so I don't think he should have done anything.
Yeah, well, I don't think Paul thought he was writing scripture. I think Paul thought the end, like this is what Del Martin points out in his book, is that Paul thought the end was coming.
That doesn't matter.
Yes, it does matter.
Look, the boat either promotes something or doesn't promote something. Regardless of the reasons don't matter. You're sort of trying to make up these excuses to say, well, at the time he was trying to do this or trying to do that. It doesn't matter. The book, for whatever reason, he could have been held at gunpoint and said, like, you've got to say this or else we'll shoot you. That doesn't mean the book says something different. It says what it says.
I actually
think you just have a chip on your shoulder about this. You pull up a single verse, right? But then you don't pay attention to any of the verses where Paul says, so don't make yourself slaves to humans again, right? You don't look at any of the passages where it says, for example, it's, now that you're out from under the law, don't submit yourself again to a yoke of slavery. Or
Galatians 5:1. I was just going to reference that. It's he's telling one group of people, don't submit to being slaves ever again. But then he's telling another group of people, go be good slaves. So even though he's talking out of both sides of his mouth on that one, he's still definitely telling one group to go be good slaves. And you can't get around the fact that even if he's, anti-slavery on one side and pro-slavery on the other, he's still pro-slavery on that side.
And what about Onesius?
And there's
what about
really
Onesius in the
reasons.
letters to Philemon?
I,
Yeah, where he
Onesius in the
tells
letters to
Onesimus to
Philemon
take back his
was
slave no longer as a slave.
an escaped slave that holed up with Paul, and Paul sent him back to the master to return to being a slave, even though Onesius begged him not to. But because it was his duty to return a slave, he returned the slave to the master, and then told the master, Timothy, I think it was, that he should free him.
No, Onesimus is the name of the slave. Okay.
Yes, that's what I said.
No, you said, and the master is the book's called Philemon.
Philemon. Yes,
right.
Philemon was the master. Yeah, and Onesius was the slave. Yes, that's.
Yeah, and so if you actually read what's happening there, is Paul says to this slave owner that I'm appealing for you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. So he's in prison.
Yep.
He meets this slave Onesimus, and he tells him to take him back no longer as a slave, but as a brother in Christ. And if he owes you anything, I'll pay it. Oh yeah, and by the way, I know that you'll do that and even more, and make some room for me because I'm going to be coming to visit you, and I'll know you'll do this and even more. Yeah. So he tells him to set him free.
Back to be a slave.
No, he doesn't. He
doesn't
sends
tell
him back
him.
to be free.
He asks him.
No, he doesn't ask him. He literally says, I have the authority to tell you what to do, but I'm going to tell you as an old man Paul instead of giving you it from the Lord. That's what he says. He doesn't ask him like, hey, man, if you would, but if not, it's okay. He literally tells him, and I'm going to come by, so be ready for me to show up. Like, people have just, like, ripped this verse. Like, if you just read it normally, it comes off the page.
Can I say something? Is that okay?
Yeah,
I know you
please
guys are
do.
in the middle of a... and boy, it gets over my head quick. You know, I'm embarrassed to admit when you talk about this historical stuff, this type of people and this type of... I really lose it. But... you know, I read the Bible plainly, and here's the problem I'm struggling with you is some things. First of all, I would read Galatians 5:1. He's talking about the yoke of slavery being sin, but that we could disagree. But it's like if we're trying to express that the Bible doesn't promote slavery, and we're taking all these external things to make it work, it just doesn't seem to be consistent. And okay, you'll know this, I believe, right off. If I read you 1 Corinthians 7:4, okay? It says, the wife does not have her authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Or other translations say, but the other spouse does. It's literally this picture, right? And this is something, obviously, if you're a non-believer, you can find very offensive. This is the picture of giving up your actual rights to your body. And again, this is expressed in multiple spaces to someone else. And you could say, well, sure, that's different because you're a willing slave. But again, but I'm making the case that the problem isn't the idea of owning someone else, let's say physical body, owning someone else. I don't think that's where the Bible has the problem. And I think because you're trying to make the argument that that's where the Bible has the problem, you're really losing the case. Because me as a Christian, I'm not trying to make a case that biblical slavery meant something else or the Bible doesn't promote slavery. I'm trying to make a case that Christ is the only answer. And that's and again, the skeptics here today, you don't have to agree with my point, or you can think it's foolishness, but that's still the case I'm called to make. But we can get, I get sad because I think, again, I'm just talking to my Christian friend here, who I believe is Christian. We can get off track if we're trying to talk about, is it a different kind of slavery or what kind of this slavery? I mean, Paul says, be obedient to your masters. And the point Mark is making is that Paul's commanding is obedience, and that could be, that promotes slavery because he is. That's what Paul's saying. But for me, it's a wonderful thing because I believe the reason Paul is saying that is because I believe that Paul's absolutely 100% convinced that there is a bigger thing than physical freedom. And because he believes there's something so much more important, so much bigger than physical freedom, he says, be willing to sacrifice your physical freedom if that's what it takes. And I don't think God takes offense to that notion. I think it's throughout Scripture. I think I think the prodigal son expresses beautifully this idea of a guy who is living in under the ownership of his father. Yes, he's in his father's house, but the idea is he doesn't want to be part of under that ownership anymore. He goes off and he finds out that being owned by the world is much worse than being owned by his dad. And what's he say? He says, even my dad's slaves, even his servants are treated better than I'm treated out in this world. And it paints a beautiful picture of what I believe God to be. And again, the skeptics can debate me there and say that God is evil. I don't agree. God's awful.
Yeah,
but again, with the skeptics, I'm agreeing.
Disciple Day, hold it. Sorry, I just got to interrupt because you're on the wrong track. Because you're saying, oh, God may be evil. We don't believe a God exists.
Yeah, I know.
So
no,
nobody is slaves under God. So if you look at it from our eyes that nobody is slaves under God and all of this isn't real, then slavery is an atrocity because you are owning another person as property like you would a pet.
Yeah, but I'm talking to not Converse because Mark, you and I are in agreement.
Well, yeah. So I get that.
Yeah.
But
so the issue is like you have to look at like I get the feeling every time I talk to people.
I just want to address
really
one thing quickly, not Converse, because I wasn't sort of finished. I wasn't finished because I was about to go on and address what you said about the letter from Philemon. Because I will read
I'll respond
out
to you
the
later.
actual. Well, you said that I didn't know what I was talking about with the passage. Now, it actually says, for this, excuse me, can I just read the passage that you said I got wrong? Can I do that, please? For this reason, though I am more than bold enough in Christ to command you to do the right thing, yet I rather appeal to you on the basis of love. And I, Paul, do this as an old man and also a prisoner of Christ Jesus. I am appealing to you for my child, Onesius. So where in that, where he says I could command you, but I'm not going to, where in that is his command?
Wow. This is like, oh my God. Like, that most Christians, not most, but a lot of Christians just say to me, don't do these Bible studies with atheists. They can read a verse that all the scholars say is like going one way. And they can read. Okay, so let me finish. And they can read the exact opposite out of it because what is the Holy Spirit isn't with them, so they can't understand it or whatever, right? And I go, no, they can understand this stuff, dude. But then when I see you do that, he says, therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do. This is what you ought do. Yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. It is none other than Paul, as an old man, now a prisoner of Jesus Christ, that I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in prison, formerly useless to you, but now as you become useful to you and me both, I'm sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so he could take your place and helping me while I'm in chains for the gospel, but I did not want to do anything without your consent. And so any favor that you would do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason so far, right? Take him back, he says.
Voluntary,
perhaps, yeah. He says, perhaps from you for a little while, you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but be better than a slave, as a dear brother. Yeah. And he is very dear to me, even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and a brother. So if you consider me your partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he's done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I call him writing this in my own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me yourself. I do wish, brother, that I may have some benefit and so forth. And he says that, be aware I'm going to come and see you and so forth.
Yeah, what does
Paul this is the frustrating thing. No, I got to say this. This is a frustrating thing. I said that Paul asked and begged him to release him as a slave, right? And you said, no, he ordered him. And this is what's frustrating about atheists, because they take whatever. Then you read it out, and he literally says, I will do nothing without your consent. It might be voluntary and not something forced. I don't know where you get this from. It's insane. And then you go on to say, it's because I don't have the Holy Spirit that I can't see it your way. When it clearly states he did not command him, he would not command him. He did it out of love, and it was voluntary.
It's ridiculous.
You're not
Yeah,
listening.
I just want to interject
I did
a couple
not say
things.
that.
One for better. There's actually some very good historical reasons that, like, you were very smart to bring up Galatians. The reason, in 25 BCE, the Galatians had become a Roman province with rights and privileges, but they had sided with Mark Antony during the Civil War. So there had been slave taking within a couple of generations. That was historical record of that time. So not becoming slaves again were really good for the people of Galatia. Second thing is, and just real quick, is I'd like to point out that within the early part of the 2nd century, there was the apostolic constitutions, which actually encouraged Christians to use their coffers, the monies that were collected, like Paul did when he was talking about his church, to actually buy the freedom of Christian slaves so they could be manumitted, to give these Christians enough money so they could purchase their freedom. Now, it seems that by the 2nd century, the early 2nd century, some communities were figuring this out, but Paul's silent on it. Paul never says, hey, let's take our money, let's buy freedom for our followers, or those of pure heart and intent. But within, about 40 to 70 years, depending on how you want to date the documents, some people in the Christian church are seeing this as a way to liberate their population. So I just think it's important to take things within their historical and cultural context as best as possible.
I will say Converse is probably going to have the last point before we get Grayson in. So if a skeptic starts talking, I may cut you off. But Converse, the floor is all yours again.
Appreciate that. Yeah. So my point, I never said that, like, you can't read it because you don't have the Holy Spirit. I said Christians say to me, dude, these people don't have the Holy Spirit, so they can't read. They'll read stuff into it out of one verse, out of an entire chapter. And I'm saying, no, I disagreed with them, was the point I made. And then I was saying that, well, Paul was saying to him, isn't that like, hey, look, if you don't do it, it's okay. No, he's saying, like, look, I'm literally going to come visit you. You should do what's right here. I could make you do what's right, but I want you to be able to figure it out for yourself, okay? And in fact, you owe me, right? So welcome him as you would welcome me. Like, this is literally a verse where he's telling him, like, dude, do the right thing. Free this guy, okay? He's a brother in Christ.
And before anyone says anything, Grayson, we are skeptic and ranting on Is the Bible Pro-Slavery? We're trying to get down to it. Hope you're doing well. What are your thoughts about the topic, the debate, or anything we've been talking about tonight?
I don't really have that much input to have. I mean, I'm an atheist. I don't know that much about the Bible. From what I do know, or what I am familiar with, it seems pretty pro-slavery, or at least tacitly endorses slavery from my knowledge. But hey, I'm an open-minded guy. If I'm listening to the arguments, I didn't mean to derail any of the conversation by joining. I just wanted to join in and get in on the discussion because it seemed like pretty good and interesting.
Not at all. I want to thank you for coming on, Grayson. Welcome to the panel. I actually am going to use this as a chance to give it to Chris because it sounds like he wanted to ask something.
Yeah, well, I'm still really confused. And again, it's weird to me that I'm on the side of the skeptic atheist on this one, but only because I feel like Christians, we should really get it right. We should know this best of all. And on the one hand, I heard you say, like, reading it by yourself and plainly, you should get it. It's simple. And then you said, well, then you used, your point was some scholars are what say it, but it's irrelevant to me. But I wonder if you don't think, but they can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think, let's say Mark, for example, is saying the Bible says enslave everyone and never free anyone. Yeah, he's not making that claim. So I would just concede. I'm not going to get in that debate about the reading of the text, but let's just concede that Paul commanded the slaves' release. That still doesn't make the claim that the Bible doesn't promote slavery, like, because they're not arguing that in every case at all time. I don't think they're saying the Bible is saying you shouldn't free a slave, and then you go, well, here's an example where the Bible says you should free a slave. At least maybe I'm wrong. I don't think that's the argument that's being made. I think the question is the Bible pro? I think that's difficult word in a sense, but let's say, does it promote slavery or condone, however you want to phrase it? It so plainly does. It just got me so confused how you could read it differently. And my bigger concern with it is it's like it's part of the story. Like it's part of what we're meant to understand. Because like that slavery, we look at it and just go, this is horrible. And so I don't think the argument from the Bible is that this idea of people as property, and I know it sounds bad. I get how it sounds, right? Is bad. It's what you do with that, because again, the picture in the prodigal son was life was better as a slave to the perfect master than life was as not a slave to the perfect master. And the world represents the imperfect master. And so if we're to say life is always better under no master, then we deny the very picture of the Bible that says we are better under God's authority, where he masters us and we are his slaves. We are literally slaves, where we say, God, your will be done. We surrender our will to God. It is the picture of slavery. Yes, God gives us a choice. I understand that. But that's part of what makes it so important to understand the Bible's view on slavery. Listen, all the time, the Bible is it uses physical ways to express spiritual realities. And the understanding I have, and again, no one has to agree, the understanding I have is that these spiritual realities are what really matter. And therefore, God will use physical things, even pain, suffering, these things, in order to help us understand that and go for the greater thing. And again, I'm not here to argue that. I'm happy to another time. We're just talking about, does the Bible condone slavery? And me and the atheists have nothing to argue about, because we both say it does. So on this topic, I have nothing to say to them, because we would just agree. And I think, he mentioned slavery without God. If you don't believe in God, it's just atrocious. And I would 100% agree with that statement. But again, not converse for you. Look, you're spending so much time defending the Bible, not through what the message of the Bible is, but through historical interpretations of slavery, historical experience of slavery. It just seems so bizarre to me, an angle to take when the Bible so clearly says, listen, slavery is an exact picture. It is an exact picture of what it looks like of your spiritual condition right now. Yeah. And I mean, again, now no one would have to agree on that, but I think it's pretty clear the Bible teaches that. And that we, instead of becoming slaves, which we are to sin, the Bible says we become slaves to God. And that slavery itself isn't the bad thing. It is the master that is bad. And I'm saying that's the case the Bible's making.
Well, Jesus said, I didn't call you servants, I called you friends, right? Paul says, yes, in Christ there is no Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, no male nor female, right? For example.
Right.
Paul says, if you can free yourself, do it, avail yourself of the opportunity. Right?
Yes. But okay. So what's he say? There's no slave, there's no free. So is he if you're using that slave to say, but if you're using that to say there's no slavery, you would use the same verse to say there's no freedom. Because he says there's no slave and there's no free. And by the way, that's right. That's what he's saying. He's saying under God, when you're in Christ, there is no longer this worldly system. That's the point. And if he can't reference the worldly system, we understand, slavery is bad. Okay. And
so can I ask you something then? Do you think that it's just inherently wrong for one person to own another person as property? Do you think that it's only contextually wrong if they're mistreated, but if they're treated really well, then it's not wrong? Like, there's nothing inherently wrong about owning another person.
Are you asking me?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Well, if I can qualify that, my answer would be yes. Because let's say I could honestly say to you, Grayson, my life is better when I have submitted my will completely to John. I'm not talking about the Bible. I'm just making up someone's name, okay? And let's say my life is better. Now, he makes better decisions than I do, and so his decisions are better. Come on, it's parenting. I own my kids. Now, legally under the law, I understand. But the only time you have a problem with me owning my kids in that sense is if I'm a bad parent, right? If I'm a perfect parent,
no.
Again, you don't like the word. It's
you
a
don't own
semantic.
your kids.
Right, of course
Yeah.
not. And not in the term you're thinking. Okay. In other
Look, I'm
words,
just going to go off on a limb here, and
Go
I'm
ahead.
just going to make the claim that it is inherently bad and wrong for one person to own another person.
So it's an
regardless of
absolute
the
truth
context.
claim? I'm asking, I'm not trying to set you up. Is that what you're saying? It's an absolute truth that it is wrong to own another person.
Yeah, I think that it's wrong to own another person regardless of the context.
Okay.
Because people are not property.
What does that mean? Like, I'm honestly not trying to be, I just don't understand what you mean by that people are not property. So you're saying the idea, you're saying people have an inherent value. They're worth more than property. And therefore, when they become property, they lose some kind of inherent value. And therefore, it's wrong. I'm asking, I'm not trying to put, I'm asking so I can understand.
I don't think it's a matter of economics. It's not about value or worth.
I don't mean financial value, but I mean somehow if owning a person is wrong, it has harmed them.
Yeah, see, I'm not making any comparison of like saying like, oh, well, like this person has this much value and property can only have this much value. I'm not comparing the level of value in any kind of economic or metaphorical sense, however you want to talk about it.
If someone
my notion that people are not property has nothing to do with like my notions of value.
What's it have to do with?
Well, let's say that somebody wanted to own you, right? Mm-hmm. You get owned and you can no longer decide where to work and what to do and when to go out and you don't have freedom anymore. But you're given really nice food and a really nice place to live. Would you accept that?
Yes. It depends if they were perfect. See, there's a caveat.
Who's perfect?
There. Well, okay, if you don't believe in God, the whole we're talking about the Bible. We're talking about, does the Bible teach? So if you were to ask me, the question of it like a philosophical one, that's different. If the Bible teaches that God is perfect, and I think the classical interpretation for me is that
God is
perfect.
Hold on a second. Sorry to point it out, but God doesn't tell you what to work, where to work, and when to go out and things like that.
I'm not saying
I'm talking about if somebody does own you and tells you where to work and when to go out and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And it was what is best for me.
No, would you be happy with that?
It's hard to say in the sense you mean it, because it would certainly depend on the master.
But here's the thing: you don't get to choose because
my wife
you're
gets
the
to tell,
property.
my wife chooses who I can sleep with. She chooses to be only her. It seems to be a choice. Come on, let's be real.
You choose who you sleep with.
No,
you can choose to respect your wife or not, but you're the one making the decision ultimately.
Right. Like the police are not going to come and arrest you if you violate your master or your wife's wishes, kind of thing. They're not going to do that. That's up to you.
Sure. And if she's a good wife, she might not kill me for sleeping with someone else. But if she's a bad wife, she might. And so, it again,
it's irrelevant.
What the fuck?
What we're talking about is an institution which determines what is allowable to you and what is not. So the rights you have for autonomy, so autonomy as in I can choose where I work. I can choose not to work at a place. I can choose to move country. I can choose to do all of these things. You don't have those rights as a slave. So would you be happy with those rights taken away if it meant you lived in comfort?
Forgive me, I misunderstood the question, I suppose.
No,
okay. I wouldn't be happy.
Then why would you expect anybody else to be?
I don't expect anyone to be happy. I'm sorry. I'm not an intellectual. I lost the point. I'm not trying to make the claim that I would rather be a slave to a human master. Yeah. So no, I'm not.
But if it's bad for you, and we can kind of agree it's bad for people, right? If they don't have the autonomy to choose where they work and when to go out and somebody orders them around, then it's bad for everybody, right?
Well, I'd say it. I wouldn't use the word bad. I'd say it's unpleasant. I wouldn't choose it. I think bad really depends on a lot of things. And certainly there are people who, again, the problem, I get the idea of the problem we're having is ownership. Like, and what does that mean?
Well, more than that, it's not just depriving people of freedom; it's depriving people of their personhood.
Yeah. Forgive me for making a bad argument. I'm not trying to make the argument that slavery is good. Remember, I'm arguing that slavery is condoned in the Bible. So I'm in agreement with you. If the question is, do I then think slavery is good? I'm talking spiritually, which of course there's no realm for you there because it doesn't exist. Okay. So, but I'm talking about something different. So I'm not talking about being a physical slave to God, like he would be some master and I'd slave to him. I'm talking about something different. And I'm not arguing that slavery is good or preferable. I'm arguing the Bible promotes it. And again, if I think sometimes we get confused. I think Christians start to argue as if the ultimate purpose of God is the physical good life of all people, right? Because then outlawing slavery becomes a must. Then things like sickness and tragedy and all this stuff become crazy, right? Because
problem of evil.
Because God's ultimate purpose is the physical good life of all people. I'm not arguing that's his purpose. I'm arguing that what Paul was thinking when he told when he would say command the slave to stay a slave or whatever we're talking about, was that he believes there was a different purpose that was higher. And that's why he would make a statement that would seem to me even outlandish, because he really believed what he was saying. And that was, it's not about this life. And that doesn't, so he's not saying aim for a poor life. He's saying, no, if you can get free, get free. He's not saying try and have a poor life. What he's saying is, listen, remember your purpose is not this life. And I think the Bible's clear that that's it. Remember, I'm not arguing with the theists even, unless we're going to argue that that's what the Bible says, is that the Bible's saying have the best life now. No, I think the Bible says that we're talking about a life that's yet to come.
So if God's purpose is to like save people's souls or whatever, you're saying that God's purpose is not concerned with like this earthly realm or whatever, then like wouldn't God be failing that purpose by giving us free will? Like if we were all actually slaves and had to do what God wanted us to do, then we would 100%, all of us would have our souls saved because we wouldn't be sinning. So like it sounds like if God's actual purpose was to like save people's souls and get people to heaven and have people like not be taken in by sin, then like God is failing in that by not making us all slaves.
No, I'm not. I think you made that statement, not me. I just said God's ultimate purpose was not the physical good life of all people. But
what is his ultimate purpose?
I think God's ultimate purpose, I really can't say in one sense, but let's say what I learned.
Does the Bible say?
Yes. Let me say what I learned from the Bible. And that would be God's ultimate purpose is his glory. And we can talk about that again, but that's the problem is that's not the topic of the night. The topic of the night is the Bible promote slavery? And again, I'm saying it does. And we're off of whether slavery is good or slavery. We moved on to the character of God.
Yeah.
But it's a whole other topic.
You're saying that God condones slavery because it glorifies him, or it fulfills this greater purpose to glorify God, and like slavery plays a part in that? That's what you're saying?
I know. I'm saying that the Bible teaches that it condones slavery. And I'm saying the Bible also makes it clear that God's ultimate purpose is not the physical good life of all people, which if we believe that, like if we agree, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the theist. If we agree that the Bible makes it clear that God's ultimate purpose is not the physical good life of all people, then it makes sense that Paul would say something like remain a slave. And it makes sense that Paul would say something like, if you could be free, get free. So I think remember, we're agreeing. And I understand the point because we want to disagree because I'm in a sense agreeing and also making a statement that's offensive because then we have to get through the problem that the Bible promotes something that it might be inherently evil.
Sure. You're definitely in a tough spot.
I don't think I'm in a tough spot
on both sides.
No, I'm not on both sides. I think
Disciple Day is being really honest. This is why for the first 1,500 years of Christianity, there really wasn't this issue. So, I mean, there were from very early beginnings in Christianity, an area I've studied with some detail. There were people, a very small minority, being vocal about the institution of slavery. Not just Christians, by the way. There were Stoics and others in Roman society who talked about the evils of slavery. But the vast majority, overwhelming majority of Christians in the early church had no reservations of the institution. They, various justifications were given, but ultimately their justifications ended up in the text itself, right, of the Christian Bible, the Old and New Testament. and ultimately became one of, everything from a divine mandate to concepts of original sin. But so when you study it, Christianity until very recently started dealing with this in a very different way than they had in their early history. But there's always been this internal battle, but it was until very recently this internal battle became slavery bad in the majority rather than the very small minority.
It was always just accepted. It was just the way things were.
Yeah, it was part of the social and moral order of the world.
And I think it's part of the story that the Bible's telling. It really appears to be that way. And I don't wrestle with it at all. And don't hear me wrong. I don't like slavery. I don't condone slavery. And so again, I feel I can talk about it with integrity, meaning I don't feel like I'm being hypocritical. I don't own slaves. But again, if what the Bible is saying is true, and again, I understand some of us here don't believe it, but for me, who believes the Bible is true, the Bible's telling a story that spiritual slavery, let's say to sin, is horribly worse than any physical slavery, and God has the right to use even the horrors of physical slavery to express that truth. I'm not saying I like it. And again, that could be another conversation. We can have the conversation about, is God good? I mean, that's a separate conversation. But I think the Bible clearly condones slavery, and it does. All of us, none of us are disagreeing that it does put boundaries on it, but we can disagree about what those are or why they're there. Okay, so let's say it condones slavery. Let's say it puts boundaries on it, and that's it. That doesn't. But I think if we take the position, which it seems like you're taking, not Converse, that if the Bible condones slavery, then God is evil or the Bible is wrong.
I didn't say any of that.
No, I know you're not saying that, but that's kind of. But I think
you just said that was my position. It's not.
No, I'm not.
My position is that you can't read the Bible from front to back and think that it promotes slavery. You just can't. There's too many passages where it's used as the worst thing ever, where it's used as a negative, where it's used as, all these passages. Like,
but I have
all the foundational stories of the Bible.
But I have. Am I
confused with slavery?
I have.
Well, obviously,
it's ambivalent.
Well, obviously you can, because people have.
I have.
I'm not saying you can't in the sense. Look, I could read Harry Potter and come away with Lord of the Rings. I'm not saying that you can't physically. I'm saying that a person, an honest person who has studied hermeneutics, right? Who has a hermeneutical standard, when they read through the Bible, if you grant certain things here, when you go to the next part, what do you have to have the same standard for the next part. You can't mix it up.
I'm sorry, this sounds like a faith-based position to me.
That's the
it
definition of special pleading.
You would be wrong because even secular scholars use hermeneutics. It's the science of interpretation.
Well, first of all,
you're just wrong.
Hermeneutics
of interpretation.
Yes, it is.
Let's
look it up.
Oh, again, I'll throw this out there. You may want to engage in an only hermeneutical approach, but then if you're not taking direct reading and engaging in historiography, I think that's the real problem as well. Not knowing the cultural context these passages and these texts were created in, their assemblages, how they were assembled, collected, and transmitted over time is just as problematic, right? So hermeneutics is one approach, but it's not the only one. So I mean, the fact that you're relying solely on hermeneutics Converse, I'm going to tell you that you keep citing academics, and I may. This is my world, right? So I'm not trying to tell me, but what I think you're engaging in is extremely biased source referencing.
Sure.
I've read your sources, but I really doubt that. Yeah, dude, I study ancient history, so you're talking. So, but this is one of the things when we talk about early Christianity, right? There are numerous texts, people like Walden and other people from earlier times. I mean, I think he's from the 1950s, 60s. We have some older. Walden. Walden is another scholar that I'm citing. You told me to start citing people, so I'm going to cite people. Okay, so there are people. We have Goldsworthy. We have several people that talk about the institution of slavery in the ancient world, and there's literally dozens of specialists in this field. One thing that most of these academics that are mainstream academics are engaged in is really trying to get through the biases of earlier authorship. One of the problems we have from basically the 18th, 19th century are extremely biased analyses of various ancient texts. I don't think that the Bible is any better or worse than the Code of Hammurabi or the 12 Tablets or the Croatian Code, these other ancient texts that talk about the institution of slavery. They're culturally unique. They have their own cultural context in which they were formulated. But when you start engaging in apologetics, and you start saying, well, this is why mine isn't as bad, or mine isn't demonstrating or promoting, but you want to say, well, the Romans texts that talk about slavery, well, obviously those are problematic. Those institutions are not reflections. But what you're saying is anyone who looks at the Old Testament and the New Testament come out of it thinking that it somehow endorses slavery is obviously reading it wrong. I think you need to check yourself and realize that we read all of those texts the same. I don't read the Old Testament any different than I read the 12 tables and other legal codes.
I'll let you have 30. Well,
I need to add something.
Both
by
have
the way,
30 seconds, but after you both have 30 seconds, we have, I believe, another Christian backstage, and so we're going to add on time to the clock just because that's our anytime we have our disagreement counter, which is people who disagree with us, we just naturally continue to add them on.
And you definitely want to hear from this guy.
But okay, Mark and Converse, because I want to let him respond also.
Well, I just want to say one thing really quickly, because Converse asked me to look up her hermeneutics and check. So hermeneutics is not a science. It is under the humanities banner, which, it is a methodology of doing something, but just because something's a methodology doesn't mean it's methodological. Naturalism is not a science, Converse. So don't gaslight me like that.
I know it's a lot to respond to, but it's all back to you.
Wait, I gaslit you for that? But where do you get this from the humanities? It's literally, I can't remember the person who cited it, but it was literally called The Science of Interpretation by somebody famous.
It may have been a metaphor.
Well, it's literally is how you interpret.
What branch of science is it?
It's not just you. Listen, a lot of people this is one of my biggest issues. I have to get past the smokescreen of, is this Christian apologetics, before I can even get somebody on the other side to consider an argument. That's the hardest part for me. Okay. Listen, Plato has hermeneutics for it. Okay. You have secular works. You have works that are poetry, where they're trying to figure out what is happening, in the text. And so they have these methods by which to, for example, you will interpret more harder passages based on more clear passages, for example, is one. So, but anyway, so to get back to the other thing, trying to remember what Pat said. Pat said, look, I've read your sources and so forth. And then he said, I think you're just doing this or that. Look, what I'm telling you is the sources that I'm talking about, like Westbrook and Laura Culbertson and Jacob Milgram, these are all sources that Josh cited in his book. So what I did was I wanted to be actually honest. So I went and bought Josh's book, Does the Bible Endorse Slavery? So I got it and I started picking up the references in the book, right? I bought the books and started to read them. And some of them are not small books, okay? So I'm actually doing the honest thing here. And I realized that, look, there is a lot being said about this that's interesting. But guess what? There's a lot of scholars that take different views. But amongst all of them, you continuously see this thing. I know Pat said, I don't think the Bible's any different than the others. You continuously see this thing in all these sources where it goes, and the Bible seems to be the only one that does this. For example, in Milgram's work, it says, and the Bible, the Hebrew text is the only one that doesn't have a distinction, a word that distinguishes a servant from a chattel slave. Only one. For example, you have the outlawing of slavery for citizens, the only source that does it, for example. And you have many of others like that. There's dozens of these.
Yeah, okay? but I proved you wrong on the whole citizenship thing. And the Romans had about 7 different words in Latin for slavery, depending on how you came into it and how you were in basically your menial status in society. We maybe Converse, maybe sometime you and I should really have a discussion of slavery, because I think you're so limited in your knowledge only to what's contained within the scripture.
Yeah,
right.
All of this.
It's secular scholarship.
None of these are Christians.
but I think they're all. I think you're all okay. They're all Christian. I don't think
No,
every
none
source,
of them
Josh.
are Christian scholars that I'm citing.
Genetic fallacy.
Yeah.
So that's a genetic fallacy.
Well,
that none of these are Christian scholars.
Mm-hmm.
How is
that
that
the
genetic
cherry pick
fallacy?
Christian scholars?
I said they're not Christian
saying...
scholars. None of them.
Okay, so I think that'd be really good, because I think you've made a lot of bold statements about, you know, the Bible. These scholars say that the Old Testament's the only one that does this and does that.
Okay.
And I really think it'd be interesting to have you prepare your position. I'll prepare my position, and we'll see which systems are truly unique. Because I don't think you want to get. I don't think you want to talk about the Code of Hammurabi. Like, is it more moral for a system to give freedom after 3 years or 7?
Yeah, I thought you might bring that up.
Yeah, well, because this is
brought up. Yeah, if you read Westbrook on it, he actually says that it's a different
all right, I'm going.
If you read selected passages of Westbrook, sure.
Yeah,
and all right, we are going to bring up another Christian, and then I see Leo back there. I think we're probably going to go live for at least another 3 to 4 more days, and so. We are adding in Emmanuel, slave of Christ, yes. And we are skeptic and ranting on is the Bible pro-slavery. Hope you are having a nice night. And what is your thoughts about the topic of the debate or anything we've been talking about tonight?
Well, I think you're focusing on the Old Testament, and you know, we're Christians, we're not Jews. So I don't know why you're focusing on Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, which both of the verses
speak up?
Were not referenced in the New Testament. So when you're talking about slavery and people owning slaves, why you're making a fallacy here? You're making a timeline, logical fallacies. That's why you're making all those mistakes. When you look at the New Testament, we are bought by a price, which is Christ. That's why the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 7:23, don't be owned by other people. Don't become bondservants of men.
Can you talk louder?
Bought by a price. So when Paul is saying, slaves obey your masters, he's talking about authority of the Roman government. He's not saying that it's okay to be enslaved by somebody. So I think you're making a lot of fallacies there.
Well, I think we were talking about the New Testament for quite a while. We're talking about the Ephesians, and we're talking about letter to Philemon. So we kind of were for a bit.
I mean, you quoted some of the New Testament scriptures, but you're not interpreting correctly. So you're not dividing the scriptures correctly.
So it's your way that has to be correct. Got it. Okay.
No, you just have to look at all the chapters and you'll understand what it's saying. When you quoted Ephesians 6:5, for example, it says slaves obey your masters, and different versions it says that servants obey your masters. So you're thinking of slavery that we had, of the American slavery, which was not in the first century. So you're making
a
difference there.
No, I'm not. I clearly said it was not as bad as antebellum slavery of the South. I said that multiple times.
Hey, Emmanuel, can you just either talk louder or talk closer into the mic? People are, and including me, are having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah.
Okay. How about that?
It's about the same.
Okay. So I think some of you heard me, so I think we could address some of the questions that I've had. So what I'm saying here is the Old Testament had a flaws because it was given by the angels. It was not even given by God. That's why Christ brought the New Testament, because the New Testament, you have a high priest, which is Jesus Christ, so it's not the same as the Old Testament. So when you're trying to code Bible scriptures like Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, it doesn't apply for New Testament church. So that's where your problem is.
Well, we're talking about epistles and letters to Philemon. So when you say it was brought by angels, how does that work? Wasn't it written by Paul?
Because Acts chapter 7 verse 53 says that you have not obeyed the law which was given through the angels. So when Moses was speaking through the burning bush, he was talking to angels. He was not speaking with God. That's why you see a lot of flaws in the Old Testament.
So are you
Paul
saying
was
I
speaking
have a
directly
question?
to God? I
Are you
don't understand.
are you saying I have a question? I'm coming from a totally theist point of view on this. Are you saying the Old Testament is not reliable?
The Old Testament is reliable, but it has a lot of errors. That's why you have the New Testament.
That's
how can
confuses me a little
be
bit.
reliable if it has errors?
It is reliable in a sense that it is historically accurate. Like
where is it unreliable? That's easier for me. Sorry, just so I'm not confused. Where is it unreliable? Because I think something can be reliable and have errors. Listen, I'm a computer programmer, and I know stuff can be reliable and yet still have errors. But I'm not saying.
Sure.
Well,
yeah.
But where? So what exactly would you say if I were to say name some things in the Old Testament that are unreliable? What would they be?
What I'm saying is the law of the Old Testament doesn't apply for the New Testament. So the New Testament, okay, let me finish my point. So in 2 Corinthians 3, it says that letter kills, but spirit gives life. So when the Old Testament was ordained but through the angels, 3,000 people died. So the Old Testament brought death upon people when the New Testament brought life. So when you're trying to read and reread what's in the Old Testament, you're actually putting a veil on your heart so that you don't turn to the Lord. That's my point.
Okay, I still don't quite get it, but I'll grant it's probably just me, because my understanding is
I don't get it either.
Is Jesus didn't come and he didn't abolish the law of the Old Testament and say it was garbage. He came and he fulfilled the law, was the idea, and that didn't make the Old Testament unreliable. It was that the Old Testament, what happened, the events of the Old Testament proved that people were unreliable. Again, I'm not talking to atheists here and asking if you agree with that statement. I'm talking to Emmanuel here. Right, wasn't that the idea? Was that what occurred? What we would call the now Old Testament wasn't writing to them; it was what was happening to them. That we would agree that it showed that the people were unreliable, not that God or His Word or His law was unreliable. Right? I'm asking. I'm just asking what you're saying.
So Matthew 5:17 says that I have not come to abolish the law. You quoted Matthew. So when Jesus